Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. I woke up to a strange feeling that day. You know, that feeling when something is off, but you can't quite place what it is? It lingered in the back of my mind as I reached for my phone. It was just a routine morning. I'd seen it all before, a little light from the window creeping in, the usual hum of the fridge in the background, the sound of distant traffic outside. But something wasn't right. The phone screen lit up, and the first thing I saw was an odd notification. Not a message, but a new note in my Notes app. I didn't remember writing anything the night before. I opened the app without thinking much about it, but when I saw the title of the note, my heart skipped a beat. It read, "Tomorrow, January 4th. I didn't know who could have written it. It had my name in it, but the words weren't mine. It described my day tomorrow in perfect detail. My schedule, step by step, hour by hour. I stared at it for a few moments, disbelief creeping in. I hadn't even planned for tomorrow yet, so how could anyone know what I was going to do? The note listed my first destination for the day, my morning coffee shop, the one I always go to when I need a quiet start to my day. But I hadn't told anyone I was going there. No one knew my plans. I scrolled down. It didn't stop there. The note included everything I did, where I'd be, when I'd be there, the precise time I would leave each place, even what I'd order for lunch. I was unsettled, but I didn't panic immediately. It could be a glitch, right? Some weird sync error in the cloud or a prank from someone who knew too much about me. But the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt. It wasn't just the detail of the note. It was the sense that I had no control over it. The note seemed too perfect, too precise. I closed the phone and tried to push the thought aside. It's nothing, I told myself. Just a weird coincidence. But the thought nagged at me as I brushed my teeth, as I made my breakfast, and as I walked out of my apartment and into the street. The rest of the morning passed uneventfully, but the memory of the note stayed with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched or controlled. I glanced at my phone several times throughout the day, waiting for the next message, but there was nothing more. Only the one disturbing note. Then, as I was heading to my afternoon meeting, I noticed something strange. The street I usually walk down seemed quieter than usual, as if everyone had disappeared. The usual noise of cars and pedestrians seemed muffled, distant, almost unreal. I brushed it off as a fluke. But it kept happening, this strange sense of quiet, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something. By the time I reached my destination, I was too distracted by the feeling of unease to focus on anything else. I checked the note again. There, listed in black and white, was my next stop, the park. The one that I never really went to anymore, but had recently started visiting again for some unknown reason. I tried to remember if I'd told anyone about it. But no, I hadn't. No one knew. How could they? I shoved the phone back into my pocket and tried to shake off the creeping feeling that something was wrong, but the tightness in my chest wouldn't go away. It was then that I noticed the footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate. Not loud, but unmistakable. They followed me as I walked. At first, I thought I was imagining things, but the footsteps didn't stop. The person behind me seemed to match my pace perfectly. I sped up, and so did they. I tried turning a corner, hoping to lose whoever it was, but the footsteps kept following. I glanced over my shoulder, but no one was there. I stopped walking and looked around, my heart pounding. The street was empty. No one in sight. And yet, I could still hear them. The footsteps. I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't just a coincidence anymore. Something was happening, something I couldn't explain. My phone buzzed in my pocket, but I didn't dare to check it. I had a feeling that whatever came next wouldn't be anything I wanted to know. Something was wrong, and it was getting closer. I stood frozen on the sidewalk, my heart racing. The sound of footsteps behind me echoed in my ears. I turned around again, but there was still no one in sight. The street, usually so full of life, now felt like a scene from a nightmare. The silence around me seemed too thick, pressing in, suffocating. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild. After all, I had read somewhere that people often felt like they were being followed when they were nervous. It was the anxiety playing tricks on my mind. But the more I tried to convince myself of that, the more the footsteps seemed real. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the phone, my hands trembling slightly. The note was still there, as if it had been waiting for me. My next destination was listed clearly, the park. I didn't want to go there. I didn't want to follow the note. But it felt like I had no choice. The phone seemed to be guiding me, controlling me. It was like I was on a path that was already laid out, with no way to turn back. I hesitated, looking down at the phone, wondering if I should just leave. But then the sound of the footsteps behind me grew louder, as if whoever, or whatever, was following me had sped up. My heart skipped a beat. I turned quickly, scanning the empty street, but no one was there. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The footsteps weren't just sounds. They were a warning. With a deep breath, I started walking again, faster now. The park was only a few blocks away, but it felt like miles. My body was tense, alert, every sense on high alert. I kept checking the phone, but it didn't offer any new information. The note hadn't changed. The park, the next stop, was still there. I had to get there, I told myself. I had to see it through. Maybe then, I would understand what was happening. The footsteps followed me, just out of sight but never far behind. Each step I took seemed to echo in my mind, louder and louder. The world around me felt smaller, as if it was shrinking with every passing moment. I reached the park, the familiar gates now looking foreign and ominous. The trees that usually offered a sense of calm seemed to loom over me, their branches swaying in a way that didn't feel natural. I stepped inside, my shoes crunching on the gravel path. The park was empty. No joggers, no families, no kids playing. Just silence and the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. But even in that silence, I could still hear the footsteps. They were closer now, unmistakable, like they were just behind me. I quickened my pace, my eyes darting around, trying to spot the source of the noise. But it was no use. The footsteps were there, and no matter how fast I moved, they kept up. I looked down at my phone again. The note had changed. You are here. I stopped dead in my tracks. My breath caught in my throat. I had no idea what to do next. There was no more instruction, no more places to go, no more paths to follow. The footsteps stopped. I froze. I could hear my own breath, ragged in the still air, but there was no one around me. No one. The park seemed different now. The air was heavier. The shadows stretched unnaturally long. I felt trapped. Suddenly, I heard a voice. It wasn't loud, but it was there, like a whisper in the back of my mind. "You can't leave now." I whipped around, but there was no one. The voice had come from nowhere. I wanted to run, to escape this nightmare, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. My eyes scanned the trees, the empty benches, the pathways that seemed to twist and turn into nowhere. Every corner of the park now seemed like a place I didn't recognize. I turned back to the phone, but the screen was blank. No note. Nothing. I felt an overwhelming urge to look over my shoulder, as if I knew something was there, just out of sight. And then I saw it. A figure. It stood at the far end of the park, just beyond the trees. It was tall, impossibly tall, with no clear features, just a shadow, a shape that didn't belong. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence. It was watching me. I should have run. I should have turned and sprinted back to the street, to the world I knew, where things made sense. But instead, I took a step forward. One step, then another. The figure didn't move, but somehow, it seemed to be waiting for me. And then, I heard it again. The voice. Louder this time, almost mocking. You knew this was coming. The footsteps were back. They were no longer behind me, though. They were all around me. All around the park, echoing, getting closer. My chest tightened with panic. The walls of the park seemed to close in. The trees leaned in, their branches twisting like fingers, as if they were about to grab me. I felt the weight of something sinister closing in, but I couldn't look away from the figure. It wasn't just a shadow. I could see something now, something faint, something familiar. A face, just barely visible in the dark. A face that looked like mine. And that was when I understood. The footsteps weren't just following me. They were coming for me. I couldn't breathe. The air had thickened, each inhalation feeling more like a struggle. My body had become frozen, caught between fear and disbelief. The figure at the end of the park, that silhouette, didn't move, but somehow, it was everything. It was watching me, and the feeling was suffocating. I tried to take a step back, but my legs refused to obey. My body felt like it was made of stone. My phone buzzed again, but I didn't dare look at it. My focus was entirely on that shape, that face, that was somehow mine. The shadows around me twisted, stretching like limbs trying to ensnare me, their movements almost imperceptible but unmistakably wrong. The park had turned from a familiar place of solitude to something alien, suffused with a growing, oppressive darkness. I was no longer in control of anything. The steps were closer now, the soft thud of movement coming from all directions. This isn't real, I told myself. But the cold in my chest, the sharp beat of my heart, the sweat creeping down my back, none of it felt fake. My senses were on high alert, every nerve in my body screaming for me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I could feel the air growing heavier, as if the very space around me had begun to warp and close in, pressing against me like a vice. And then, I heard the voice again. You've been chosen. It was clearer this time, as if the words came from inside my own mind, twisting and distorting with each passing second. I could no longer tell where the voice was coming from. It was everywhere and nowhere, in the trees, in the ground beneath my feet, in the air I breathed. The figure remained still, but its presence was everywhere now, inescapable. "You've been given a path," the voice continued. "And now, it's time to follow it." Something twisted in my gut. The phone buzzed once more, and with trembling hands, I glanced down. The note had returned, but it was different now. The text seemed to move before my eyes, shifting and rearranging itself. "Turn around." The words were clear, direct, and impossible to ignore. I didn't want to. I didn't want to do anything that the note said anymore. But as if controlled by some unseen force, my head slowly turned, my body unwillingly following the command. The figure at the end of the park was closer now, impossibly close, and I could see its face more clearly. Or rather, the face that mirrored mine. The features were indistinct, blurry, but unmistakably mine, my eyes, my nose, my lips, but twisted, distorted into something wrong. A chill ran down my spine as the reflection of myself smiled. It wasn't my smile. It was something else. Something that wasn't me. I took a step back, but it was too late. The footsteps, now overwhelming, thundered around me, the sound of hundreds of feet pounding against the earth, but no one was there. The figure stepped forward. I couldn't move. The air was thick, like a heavy fog that made every breath feel like it might be my last. I could still hear the footsteps, feel them getting closer, but no one was around me. There was just that thing. That thing that wasn't me. The figure raised its hand. Its fingers, long and sharp, reached out toward me. "You cannot escape," it whispered, its voice merging with my own, so close I could feel it in my chest. "You are already here." I stumbled back, my mind screaming, "This isn't real." But every inch of my body told me it was. The park, the trees, the shadows, they had all become something alive. The ground beneath me seemed to pulse, as if the earth itself was breathing. The air shimmered, vibrating with something I couldn't understand. The figure continued to advance, slow and deliberate. The reflection of myself didn't speak anymore. It just watched. And it smiled. I felt my phone buzz again, this time more insistent, as if it were pulling me back to reality. My hand shook as I grabbed it, trying to tear my eyes away from the figure that mirrored me. The note had changed again, the words now taunting me. "Turn around. It's waiting." I glanced over my shoulder. The park had shifted. The familiar trees were now looming, their branches hanging low, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. The path ahead was no longer clear. It was a tunnel, a narrowing, suffocating passage leading to the unknown. I knew what I had to do, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. The figure in front of me had stopped moving, but its smile never faded. It was as if it was waiting for me to make a choice, to take that final step, to follow the path. The footsteps were louder now, deafening. They weren't just behind me anymore, they were everywhere, inside me. It was as if the world itself was chasing me. I turned and ran. My legs were moving, but I wasn't controlling them. The park had become a labyrinth, the path twisting and shifting as I ran through it, unable to escape the maze. The trees seemed to close in on me, their shadows stretching like hands trying to pull me under. I glanced at my phone again, but the note had disappeared. There was nothing now, just a blank screen. But I didn't need the note to tell me where to go anymore. The footsteps were growing louder. I was close to the edge of the park. If I could just make it to the gates, to the street, I could escape. But when I reached the gates, I stopped dead in my tracks. The figure was standing in front of me. My reflection. But it wasn't just looking at me anymore. It was smiling. And that's when I realized I hadn't been running from the figure. I had been running toward it. And now there was nowhere left to run. I stood at the gates, my breath shallow, my body trembling. The reflection, my reflection, was closer than ever. Its smile had stretched wider, as if it were savoring my fear, feeding off it. The air around me grew colder. Each breath I took felt heavier, as if the world itself was thickening, trapping me here. The footsteps continued to echo in my ears, but they no longer felt like they were from behind me. They were inside me. They were mine. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence. It was as though it had always been there, waiting for me, just beyond the veil of the ordinary world. The gate in front of me, the one that should have been my escape, felt like a wall now. I took a step forward, my mind telling me to run, to fight, but my legs wouldn't obey. Instead, I walked, slowly, as if something invisible were pulling me closer to it. Closer to the reflection that wasn't quite mine. Each step felt like I was sinking deeper into something dark, something I couldn't escape. "You can't outrun this," the figure finally spoke. Its voice was my voice, but it was colder, hollow. "It's always been you. Always." I wanted to scream, to argue, but no words came. I felt the weight of the truth crushing me, suffocating me. My phone buzzed in my pocket again, but I didn't need to look at it. The note, the voice, the footsteps, the reflection, it was all one thing now. It was a single force, twisting me into something I didn't recognize. The reflection stepped closer, and this time I couldn't stop it. It reached out, its hand, my hand, reaching for me. I tried to back away, but my feet wouldn't move. I was trapped in place, frozen in fear, my heart pounding in my chest. "You were never meant to escape," the reflection whispered. Its voice was mine, but it wasn't. It was dark, sinister, full of things I didn't want to hear. I reached for my phone, desperate for something to make sense of all of this, to stop it. But as I pulled it out, the screen flickered and went black. No notes, no messages, no map. Just darkness. The only thing left was the figure. No, the thing that wasn't me, but was. "You wanted to change your path," it said, its fingers curling toward my wrist. "But the path was always here. You just needed to see it." I closed my eyes, willing myself to wake up, to escape this nightmare. But when I opened them again, nothing had changed. The figure was still there, smiling that terrible smile, its face too familiar and too wrong. The footsteps grew louder, now pounding in my head like a drum. I could feel them pushing me closer to the reflection. The world around me seemed to spin, the trees and the path blurring into a vortex of movement. The figure's eyes, my eyes, pierced into me as if it could see straight through to the darkest parts of my soul. "I am you," it said softly, almost tenderly. "And you are me. There's nowhere left to run." I wanted to scream, to fight back, to do something, anything, but my body wouldn't move. It was as if I was locked in place, bound by some invisible force. The reflection reached out, its hand brushing my cheek. A cold shiver ran through me, its touch colder than ice, like death itself. And then it happened. The world shifted. The park, the reflection, everything around me fractured, crumbling, dissolving. The trees, the gates, the path, they all faded, leaving nothing but the overwhelming sound of footsteps, growing louder, growing closer. I blinked, and I was no longer in the park. I was in my own apartment. But it wasn't my apartment. The walls were darker, the air heavier. The hum of the fridge was gone, replaced by an unnatural silence. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. I looked at my phone in my hand. It was glowing again, but the screen was different. The note was back, but the words had changed once more. You are home. I stepped back, my heart racing. The figure, the reflection, was gone, but its presence lingered in the room, pressing against me like a weight. I could still hear its voice, still feel its touch. It was as if it had followed me here, into my home, into my life. And then I heard something else. A noise, soft at first, but unmistakable. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway. The very same sound I had heard in the park. The sound that had haunted me. The footsteps were coming for me again. This time, I didn't have to turn around to know what was behind me. I was not alone anymore. And I knew, deep down, that I would never be alone again. The footsteps grew louder, but this time, they were coming from everywhere. They weren't just behind me, they were inside the walls, under the floorboards, in the very air I breathed. They surrounded me, suffocating me, and I knew that I would never escape them. I turned to face the doorway, my legs shaking beneath me. The silence had been replaced by the relentless rhythm of those footsteps, growing nearer, closer. I reached for the door, but it wouldn't open. It was as if the house itself had locked me in, trapping me here. The footsteps stopped. And then I heard it. You knew this would happen. I turned around, slowly, my eyes scanning the room. The reflection, my reflection, stood in the doorway. It wasn't just a shadow anymore, it was real, solid, its eyes burning into mine. You can't run anymore, it said, stepping forward. Its voice was low, calm, but with an edge of something darker. This is your world now. I wanted to fight. I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped my mouth. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The reflection reached out, and this time I didn't fight back. It took my hand, and when it did, I felt the last piece of myself slip away. The footsteps continued, forever echoing in the silence of a world that no longer belonged to me. And I knew, deep down, the truth. There was no escape. There never had been. And now, I was the one following. Days passed, or perhaps it was only hours, I could no longer tell. Time had become a blur, a concept that no longer held any meaning in this world I found myself in. My apartment was the same, but it wasn't. It was as though every corner, every shadow, held a part of me I couldn't escape. The walls seemed to breathe, shifting with the rhythm of my own heartbeat. The air was thick, heavier than before. I sat in the same chair I had sat in countless times before, staring at the blank screen of my phone. The note never returned. There was no more text, no more instructions. But the footsteps, they never stopped. They were always there, echoing softly in the back of my mind, always present, always just beyond the edge of my perception. The reflection, my reflection, was never far behind. It had become part of me, a shadow that clung to every movement, every thought. It whispered to me when I woke, when I slept, when I tried to pretend things were normal. I tried to leave, tried to run again, but no matter where I went, it followed. No matter where I hid, it was there, right behind me, just out of sight, always watching, always waiting. There was no escape. Not from the reflection. Not from the footsteps. They were me. And I was them. The figure, once a shadow at the edge of my vision, was now fully integrated into my world. It was part of me, part of everything I saw, felt, and experienced. It wasn't just following me anymore. It had become me. And as I sat in the quiet of my apartment, the footsteps grew louder again, their rhythm growing more insistent. I closed my eyes, trying to block it out, trying to force myself into some kind of normalcy, but it didn't matter. I could hear them, feel them, inside me. I opened my eyes, and there it was. The reflection, standing just beyond the window, its eyes meeting mine through the glass. Its smile never wavered, never faded. It was waiting. But this time, I didn't feel the overwhelming panic I once did. I didn't feel fear. Instead, I felt calm, acceptance. The path had always been there, after all. The reflection had always been me, and I had always been it. The footsteps began again, closer this time, and I understood now. I understood that the path was endless. There was no final destination, no moment of clarity, no escape. The path was just the path. It was the footsteps. It was the reflection. I stood, stepping away from the window, my heart no longer racing. The reflection in the glass smiled at me, the same smile that had haunted me, but now it was no longer terrifying. It was a part of me. I was it. It was me. And as the footsteps grew louder, I realized one final truth: there would never be an end. There would only be the walking, the following, the endless, eternal chase. And now, I was the one leading it. Have you ever wondered what lies beneath the ground you walk on every day? What if the place you thought you knew, the place where you feel safest, holds a secret, one that is waiting to be uncovered, one that was never meant to see the light of day? I never thought I'd find the answer to that question, at least not in the way I did. It all started with a renovation. A simple task. Nothing special. A house, built decades ago, was being renovated by a crew of workers. The walls, the floorboards, the ceiling, all were getting a much-needed upgrade. The place was old, but sturdy, and everything seemed straightforward. That is, until they discovered the hidden door. It wasn't much at first. Just a crack in the foundation, a small opening in the wall behind an old wooden shelf that had been sitting in the corner for years. They had been clearing out the space, knocking down walls and lifting floorboards when one of the workers, Greg, happened to move a heavy shelf and noticed something strange, an unfamiliar space, one that didn't seem to belong. It wasn't marked on any plans. There was no mention of it in the house's history. It was just there. Curiosity got the better of Greg, and like most people in our line of work, he thought little of it. A hole in the wall? Just another part of an old house with hidden nooks and crannies, right? He knocked on the wall, heard the hollow sound, and pushed harder. After a few moments, the wall gave way. He stepped back, eyes wide with excitement. "Hey, guys, look at this." I remember hearing him call out from the other room. I was managing the project, overseeing everything. At first, I didn't think much of it. just another section of the house being uncovered. But when I walked into the room, I felt a slight shift in the air. The temperature had dropped just by a few degrees. Nothing that would raise an immediate alarm, but it was noticeable. The space behind the wall wasn't just empty. It was a tunnel, narrow and winding, leading deep into the earth beneath the house. The floor was uneven, with broken stone and dust that hadn't seen the light of day for decades, maybe longer. Greg, with his usual bravado, was the first to step inside. "What's the worst that could happen?" he joked, holding up a flashlight and heading deeper. The others hesitated, glancing at each other nervously. But Greg was always the adventurous type. One by one, the rest of the crew followed. I stayed at the entrance, watching them disappear into the dark. There was something unsettling about the place, a heavy silence that felt wrong. But I pushed it aside. It was just a tunnel, probably an old utility passage or something. I waited. Minutes passed. Then it was 10 minutes. Then 20. I started to get uneasy. They should have been back by now. I called out their names, but there was no answer. Just the echo of my own voice bouncing off the walls. The air grew even colder, and now I could hear a faint scratching sound coming from deep within the tunnel. It wasn't quite a whisper, but something in the sound sent a chill down my spine. I took a hesitant step forward, calling out again, but still no response. The tunnel stretched endlessly ahead of me, and the silence that had followed them was suffocating. There was no movement, no sign of life. Just the deep, unsettling quiet. Another 10 minutes passed, and now I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. Something wasn't right. I had to go in. I grabbed the flashlight, my hand shaking. I didn't want to go in, but I knew I had to. My mind raced with thoughts, most of them trying to justify the situation. Maybe they were just messing around, hiding from me. Maybe they found something interesting. Maybe they... I took a deep breath and stepped into the tunnel. The walls were cold to the touch, and the deeper I went, the darker it became. The air felt thick, as if it had been trapped for years, stagnant and oppressive. I could feel it pressing against my chest with every breath I took. The scratching noise was louder now, and my pulse quickened. It sounded closer. It sounded like footsteps. But no one had come back. I pushed forward, my flashlight barely cutting through the dark. I called their names again, but there was no answer. Suddenly, I heard a soft thud ahead of me. My heart skipped a beat. It wasn't from the direction I had come, but from further down the tunnel. It was faint, but unmistakable. It wasn't the sound of footsteps. There was something more to it, something more unnatural. I picked up my pace, my shoes tapping lightly on the stone floor, but the further I walked, the more the air seemed to grow heavy, thick with something I couldn't place. The scratching noise intensified. It was almost like claws scraping against the stone, a low, dragging sound that made my skin crawl. And then I heard it, a voice. But it wasn't anyone I recognized. It wasn't any of the workers. It was soft at first, a faint whisper that barely reached my ears. I stopped dead in my tracks, straining to hear, but it was gone. I waited, holding my breath, and listened. Nothing. I took another step, and then a crash. The sound of something breaking, something shattering deep in the tunnel. I couldn't move. The sound was coming from ahead. And then, footsteps. Fast, frantic footsteps. Someone was running, or something. But there was no one there. I turned to run, but something stopped me. A figure, just at the edge of my flashlight's beam, stood at the far end of the tunnel. And it was moving closer. My legs felt like lead, my chest tightening with each shallow breath I took. The figure, its silhouette barely visible in the dim light, was moving toward me at an unnatural pace. I didn't know what it was, but I felt its presence deep within my bones, like a pressure weighing down on me. The footsteps, those frantic, pounding steps, stopped. Everything fell silent again. The oppressive quiet hung in the air, thick and suffocating, and for a moment, I wondered if I had imagined it. Maybe it was just the darkness playing tricks on my mind. But no! I could still feel it, still sense that something was wrong. My heart raced, pounding in my chest as I slowly took a step back. My flashlight trembled in my hand, its weak beam casting shadows on the walls. And then it moved again. Faster this time. The figure shot forward, almost as if it had been waiting for me to make the first move. I froze, too paralyzed to react. It was so close now, its form more distinct in the light. It was tall, taller than any person should be. Its outline was distorted, as if it were made of something fluid, something that didn't belong to this world. The edges of its shape flickered in and out of focus, like a glitch in the air. I took a step back, and the figure followed. I could feel it now, its cold, unnatural presence filling the space around me. I turned to run, but the tunnel seemed to stretch farther than it had before, the walls closing in as if they were pushing me deeper inside. The flashlight's beam flickered and dimmed, and the oppressive darkness closed in around me. I heard the voice again, that whisper, coming from all directions at once. It was low, guttural, barely intelligible, but I could make out a single word. Stay. It wasn't a command, but a suggestion, one I had no intention of following. My legs moved before I could think, my body reacting out of pure instinct. I didn't know what was behind me, but I knew I had to get out of here. The walls, the tunnel, the cold, it was all pressing on me, trapping me. And then, just as I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw the light ahead. The entrance. I pushed myself forward, my breath ragged, and nearly collided with the wall at the far end of the tunnel. But it wasn't the entrance. It was another wall, solid and unyielding. There was no way out. I spun around, my mind racing. My heart pounded in my ears. The figure was gone, but I could still feel it, its presence, just beyond my vision. The walls seemed to breathe with every exhale, every pulse of fear that coursed through me. I pounded my fist against the wall, desperate. There had to be an exit. There had to be something. I turned, looking for another path, but the tunnel stretched endlessly before me. I couldn't see the beginning or the end. It was just a hole, a deep pit beneath the earth that had no intention of letting me leave. The scratching noise started again, closer this time. It wasn't just claws scraping against stone anymore. It was something else, something heavier, more deliberate. The sound echoed off the walls, each scrape like a warning. I heard it then. Footsteps. Not distant this time, but close. Rapid. Pounding. Someone was coming toward me. Or something. I couldn't stay. I couldn't stay in this place any longer. I ran. The walls seemed to close in with every step, the narrow passage getting tighter, the air getting thicker. The flashlight's beam shook wildly as I turned corners, lost in a maze of darkness. The footsteps were growing louder, but I couldn't see anyone. I couldn't see anything. And then I heard them. Voices. Low, whispered voices, filling the air around me. The whispers weren't clear, but they were unmistakable, words that seemed to twist in my mind, scratching at the edges of my thoughts. I couldn't understand them, but I could feel their weight. "They're coming for you." The words were clear now, and they weren't mine. The voices were deep, guttural, each one echoing with a sense of hunger, of something waiting just out of reach. I turned another corner, and that's when I saw it. The shadow in the distance, the flickering figure. It was back, its form more defined now, more solid. But there was something else with it. A movement, a flicker in the air, like a distortion. I couldn't tell if it was human or something else entirely. Its outline was wrong, its arms too long, its face, nothing I could recognize. It wasn't right. I turned and ran, not looking back, not caring about the direction anymore. I was running on pure fear, my body moving faster than my mind could process. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how many corners I turned, it was always there, just ahead of me. The footsteps were relentless, a pounding that vibrated through my bones. I reached what I thought was the end. A small door, hidden in the wall. I slammed my hand against it, desperate, frantic. The handle turned with ease. I flung the door open and stumbled into the room beyond. It was empty. The room was bare, nothing but dirt and stone. But then I heard it again. The whispering. It was louder now. It was in the room with me, surrounding me. The walls seemed to close in, the ceiling lowering, the floor shifting beneath my feet. The door slammed shut behind me, and I was trapped again, surrounded by the voices that now filled the room. And that was when I realized something. I was never meant to escape. The footsteps, the whispers, the figure, they were all part of it, part of this place. And now, I was part of it too. There was no way out. The room felt smaller with each passing second. The walls, once a distant blur, seemed to press in closer, their cold stone surfaces narrowing the space. I tried to breathe, but the air was thick, heavy with the smell of old earth and something metallic. The whispers were growing louder, filling my head with a sound that was both distant and all-encompassing, like a chorus of voices that had no beginning and no end. I pressed my palms to my ears, but it did no good. The voices were inside my head now, pushing against the walls of my thoughts, clawing their way through. I couldn't focus on anything but their incessant murmurs. "Stay. You can't leave. You never will." I tried to move, to find an escape, but there was nowhere to go. The door had slammed shut behind me, and when I turned to look at it, it was no longer a door. It had become part of the wall, the edges blending seamlessly into the stone as if it had never existed at all. I was trapped. Completely, utterly trapped. I paced the room, the sound of my footsteps unnervingly loud against the silence, but the more I moved, the more the whispers seemed to change, becoming more insistent. They weren't just voices anymore, they were shapes wrapping around me, twisting into things I couldn't comprehend. Shadows flickered at the edges of my vision, moving just out of reach. I spun around, trying to keep my bearings, but the space felt like it was closing in on me. My chest tightened with each breath, my pulse quickening. My hands shook uncontrollably as I reached out, brushing against the stone walls for some semblance of stability. But there was nothing to hold on to. It was all a dream, or maybe a nightmare. And that's when I heard it. A faint scraping sound just behind me. A soft, dragging noise, like something dragging its fingers along the floor. I whirled around, flashlight in hand, but I saw nothing. The room was empty, save for the cold stone and the lingering darkness. But the scraping noise didn't stop. It was getting closer. I backed away, heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it, a presence, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. It was too dark to make out any details, but I knew it was there, waiting. And then, suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It wasn't human. Not completely. It was tall, far taller than any person should be. Its limbs were elongated, too long, stretching unnaturally toward the floor. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, like a corpse that had been buried too long. Its face was nothing. There were no features, no eyes, no mouth, just a smooth, featureless surface where its face should have been. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The figure took a step forward, its feet scraping against the floor, the noise growing louder with each movement. It was slow, deliberate, like it was savoring my fear. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice wasn't a whisper this time. It was clear, deep, hollow. The figure's arms reached out, long fingers curling toward me, and I instinctively took a step back. But there was nowhere to go. The walls had closed in even tighter. I was trapped in a box, with nowhere to run. I had to fight. I swung the flashlight at it, the beam flickering wildly. The light connected with its body, but it did nothing. The figure didn't flinch. It didn't even react. It just kept coming, its steps slow and steady, its empty face staring into mine. I backed up further, my mind racing. There had to be a way out. There had to be something, anything, that could help me escape. And then I remembered the whispers. The words they had said, "You never will leave." I realized with a sickening feeling in my stomach that they weren't just talking about the room. They were talking about me. I wasn't meant to leave this place. I was never meant to escape. The figure was closer now. It was standing right in front of me, its cold presence filling the air. I could feel the chill emanating from its form, a bone-deep cold that sank into my skin. I screamed, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, paralyzed by fear. I could feel my body trembling, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run, to do anything, but I couldn't. The figure's hand reached out, its fingers brushing against my arm, and the contact sent a shock through me, a sharp, icy jolt that stole the breath from my lungs. I stumbled backward, falling to the ground. I had no strength left. I was going to die here. But just as I thought that, the figure stopped. It paused, its hand still hovering above me, and for the briefest moment, everything went still. The whispers faded, the room grew quieter. I could hear my own breath, ragged and shallow. Then, the figure spoke again. This time, it wasn't a command. It wasn't a whisper. It was a statement, clear and final. "You are one of us now." And then it was gone. The room was empty again. The coldness lingered, but the figure was no longer there. I looked around, desperate to find any sign of escape, but nothing had changed. The walls were the same. The door was gone. I was still trapped, still confined to this space, with no way out. The whispers returned, but they weren't the same. They were louder now, filling the room with an unbearable weight. "You will stay." And then I understood. The room wasn't just a place. It was a trap, a prison. I wasn't alone anymore. I had become part of the darkness, part of whatever waited beneath the earth. And there was no going back. The room no longer felt like a space. It had become a living thing, breathing in time with me, pulsating in the silence. I was caught in its rhythm, in its suffocating embrace, with no escape and no way out. Every breath I took seemed to draw the darkness closer. Every movement, no matter how small, felt like a betrayal. I was beginning to understand the true meaning of isolation. And then, I saw them. They weren't there before. At least, not that I noticed. But now, they were impossible to ignore. Eyes. Hundreds of them. Everywhere. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but they didn't disappear. They were all around me, scattered across the walls like holes in the fabric of the room. Some were large, others small. Some were human-like, others not. The shapes around them blurred, shifting in and out of focus, but the eyes stayed locked on me. Unblinking. Unforgiving. I froze. I had no choice but to stare back. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to look away, to turn my back and run. But I couldn't. Something was forcing me to keep my gaze fixed on them, drawing me in like a spider's web pulling at its prey. One by one, the eyes blinked slowly, methodically, as though they were testing me, measuring me. Their gaze was cold, clinical, and I could feel the weight of their scrutiny pressing on me. You are not alone. The words echoed in my mind, but they weren't spoken aloud. They came from the eyes themselves, a chorus of voices merging into one. I stumbled backward, desperate to escape their gaze. But it was no use. Every direction I turned, they were there, staring, watching, waiting. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the blood rushing in my ears. My palms were slick with sweat. The air felt heavier, more oppressive, as though the room itself was closing in tighter. And then, just as I thought I could take no more, a figure moved in the corner of my vision. It was fleeting, barely noticeable, but I saw it. A shape, shrouded in shadow. A movement too quick to follow, but too deliberate to be ignored. I turned my head sharply, expecting to see something, anything, but there was nothing there. Just the eyes. The whispering started again, rising like a wave. Not alone. Not alone. I felt the panic surging through me. This couldn't be real. I couldn't be trapped in a room with this. The eyes weren't the only thing in the room now. I could hear something else. A slow, methodical scraping, like nails against stone. The sound was too close, too real. I turned toward the noise, and then I saw it. A figure, low to the ground, creeping along the edge of the room. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like a broken marionette. It was hard to make out at first, its form blending into the darkness. But as it moved into the weak light, I saw it clearly. It was humanoid, but wrong. So wrong. Its body was thin, skeletal, stretched in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Its skin was an ashen gray, and its face, if you could call it a face, was distorted. Hollow eyes, no nose, just an empty mouth that stretched too wide, too unnaturally. It wasn't walking. It was crawling, dragging its body along the ground with an unholy speed, its limbs scraping against the floor, leaving deep gouges in the stone. And as it moved, its face seemed to shift, its mouth opening and closing, making a sound I couldn't understand. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. There was no escape. No way to fight this. It wasn't just the room that was alive, it was everything inside it. It was the eyes, the whispers, the things in the dark. I backed up, my chest tightening with every breath, and bumped into something cold and hard. I spun around, heart in my throat, expecting to find more of those things, but there was only the wall. Solid. Unyielding. Except for the eyes. The eyes were closer now. So much closer. They were no longer scattered around the walls, but had gathered, creeping toward me, filling every corner of the room. I pressed my back against the wall, trying to make myself as small as possible. I closed my eyes, desperate for an escape from the overwhelming sight of them. But even with my eyes shut, I could see them. They were in my mind now, inside my head, staring into me from all sides. Stay with us. The voice came from everywhere, the words crawling into my ears, burrowing deep within me. The crawling figure had stopped. It was silent now. Still. I dared to open my eyes. And I saw it. The figure was standing in front of me now, inches away, its ghastly face hovering just above mine. Its hollow eyes were wide open, staring into me, filling me with an emptiness that swallowed every thought, every shred of sanity I had left. Its mouth stretched, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth that glistened in the dim light. Join us. The voice was clearer now. The words were not a suggestion. They were an inevitability. I felt my body move against my will. I couldn't stop it. My legs, my arms, everything was moving in sync with the darkness, as if the room was pulling me toward them. I closed my eyes again, trying to block out the horror, but it was no use. It was too late. I had already become a part of the darkness. I had already joined them, and I would never leave. The air was thick with something unnatural, heavy and suffocating. I could feel it closing in around me, like the walls of the room were trying to swallow me whole. My thoughts were no longer my own. The whispers had become an indistinguishable hum, filling my head, twisting everything I had ever known into something I couldn't recognize. The figure was still there, but it wasn't the only one. As I stared into the darkness, shapes were emerging, more of them, creeping from the corners, from the walls, from the very floor beneath me. They had no form, no structure, just darkness and shifting shapes, but they were there. They were waiting. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I was being pulled deeper into the room, deeper into the darkness, as if the space itself was consuming me. My limbs felt like lead, my body heavy, like it had been drained of every ounce of energy. And then, the voice spoke again. This time, it was louder, clearer. But it wasn't the whispering. It was a command. A demand. You are ours now. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, tight, as though something had gripped it from the inside. My vision blurred, and I could feel my heartbeat in my skull, each pulse thundering through my body. The eyes. They were everywhere now. And they weren't just watching. They were feeding, growing, expanding. They were inside me, burrowing into my mind, my thoughts, my soul. I stumbled backward, the ground beneath me shifting, and suddenly there was nothing. No wall. No room. No escape. The space around me opened into something else, something far darker, far deeper. I was falling. But it wasn't the fall that terrified me. It was the realization that I had never been on solid ground. I had never been in the room at all. The room was just a prison, a thin veil, a trick of my mind. The real space, the real place, was something deeper. Something worse. I was falling, but I wasn't alone. There were others. I could feel them. Their presence pressing in on me, filling the space with their cold, empty gaze. I tried to scream again, but it was swallowed by the silence of the abyss. Time lost all meaning. Minutes? Hours? Days? I couldn't tell anymore. All I knew was that I was falling through an endless expanse of black, unable to stop, unable to escape. The walls, the ones I thought had trapped me, were gone, erased by the emptiness of the void. There was only the descent. The dark. And as I fell, I realized something that made the ground fall away beneath me even more. I had been here before. I had always been here. The room, the shadows, the whispers, they were just the surface. The beginning of something far more profound. Far more terrifying. This was where it had all begun. Where it had always been. And we were part of it. Part of the endless dark. The whispers were not just sounds. They were memories. Not my memories. Not my past. But the past of everything that had ever been trapped in this place, in this endless below. The things that had fallen before me, the souls that had been absorbed, one by one. I was no different. I was no exception. I heard the voices. They weren't just in my head anymore. They were coming from the dark, from the pit that seemed to stretch forever, the pit that was now a part of me. And as I heard them, I understood. The dark was not a place. It was a state. A state of endless, mindless descent. And I wasn't going to survive it. No one would. I had joined them. The ones who had fallen. The ones who never returned. I was just one more soul lost to the darkness. I reached out into the black, feeling for something, anything, but my hand met only cold emptiness. And then, for the first time since I had arrived, I understood what it meant to truly be alone. I had never been alone before. And now, I never would be again. The darkness swallowed me whole, and the whispers became my own. Have you ever wondered if the world around you is truly as it seems? If the walls you walk by every day could suddenly crack open to reveal something you never expected? What if the seemingly ordinary events of your life were nothing more than a mask, hiding the truths that could make your skin crawl? That was the question that gnawed at my mind the moment I unfolded the ticket. A ticket for a simple theatrical performance. I had no particular interest in the show, but it was something to do, a distraction from the usual routine. The date was set, the time was marked, and I figured I would have a quiet evening in a small, old theater. Nothing to be concerned about. But when I sat down in my seat and pulled the ticket out to examine it once more, I noticed something strange. It wasn't just a standard ticket. No. That's what I first thought, but the more I looked, the more I saw. On the back, faintly scratched into the paper, so lightly that I almost missed it, were words written in a hurried, uneven scrawl. They seemed like instructions, or perhaps a warning. Find the red door at the back of the lobby. Follow the stairs down. Don't look back. My breath caught in my throat. I had no idea who would leave such a message on a ticket, certainly not the theater staff. There was no way this could be a part of the performance. I looked around at the people settling into their seats, none of them paying attention to their tickets like I was. It felt absurd, even irrational, to consider the possibility that this could be real. But something in my gut told me otherwise. The show started soon after, but I couldn't focus. The actors on stage were moving, their voices clear, but they sounded distant, as though they were speaking from another world entirely. My mind kept drifting back to those instructions. After a few minutes, I could stand it no longer. I quietly stood, excusing myself, and made my way to the lobby. The theater was old, with an air of mystery hanging around it. The wooden floors creaked underfoot, and the faint smell of dust and age lingered in the air. I scanned the room for the red door. It was near the far end of the lobby, hidden behind a thick velvet curtain, which I hadn't noticed when I entered. Something felt wrong about it. The door was too small, almost insignificant compared to the grand architecture around it. Yet there it was, like it had always been there, waiting. I approached it, a strange unease creeping up my spine. I reached out to touch the handle, and as my hand made contact, a chill shot up my arm. The door was cold, colder than it should have been. I hesitated. "Don't look back." The words echoed in my mind, and before I could second-guess myself, I turned the handle and stepped through. It wasn't what I expected. I stepped into what seemed like a narrow hallway, dimly lit by a few flickering bulbs. The walls were made of aged stone, slick with moisture, and the air smelled damp and stale. It was like stepping into another world entirely, a world that had been hidden beneath the theater for years. The hallway stretched on longer than I anticipated. The farther I walked, the more the sounds of the theater above seemed to fade away, swallowed by the growing silence of this hidden space. I could hear my footsteps echoing off the walls, and with every step, I felt the temperature drop. My breath fogged in front of me, and a shiver ran down my spine. And then, I saw it. At the end of the hall, just before the path curved out of sight, there was a staircase. Old and rusted, it seemed to lead deeper underground. I could almost hear a faint sound, like a murmur, distant but clear, coming from below. A voice. Or was it multiple voices? Against every instinct in my body, I descended the stairs. The air became heavier with each step. The murmur grew louder. My heartbeat quickened, and I began to wonder if I had made a terrible mistake. But by now, it was too late to turn back. The stairs wound down, spiraling into the dark unknown. And then, suddenly, the murmur stopped. The silence was suffocating. I reached the bottom and found myself in a wide, open space. There was nothing but darkness. The faint smell of something metallic lingered in the air, and the cold was almost unbearable. My eyes strained to see anything at all, but there was only the dark void. And then I heard something. A soft shuffle of footsteps. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't alone. A figure emerged from the darkness. A tall, shadowed figure. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its gaze on me, like it was watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. The figure didn't speak. It didn't need to. In that moment, I understood that I wasn't supposed to be here. The path, the door, the ticket, it had all led me here for a reason. And now, I was part of whatever lay beyond the walls of the theater. I stepped back, but the figure was closer now, almost too close. And in the suffocating silence, I could feel my reality bending, warping. Something was changing, and I wasn't sure if I could survive it. I froze. The figure was standing directly in front of me now, towering in the darkness. It wasn't moving, but I could feel its presence pressing in, suffocating me. It felt like time had stopped, like the very air had thickened around me, making it difficult to breathe. I tried to step back, but my legs felt like lead, unwilling to obey. I felt trapped in the moment, my every instinct screaming to flee, but my body refusing to act. The silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive. Then, just when I thought I might break under the weight of it, the figure spoke, its voice not human, not quite real. "You shouldn't have come." The words were cold, flat, and empty, as if they had been spoken by something that didn't understand fear, didn't understand life. My heart pounded in my chest, and I tried to swallow the lump in my throat, but it wouldn't go away. I had no idea what was happening or why, but I knew in that moment that I needed to leave. I needed to get out. "You don't belong here." The voice was growing louder now, like a distant rumble that started to reverberate within my chest, vibrating my bones. I blinked rapidly, trying to clear my vision. The shadows around me seemed to shift, becoming thicker, more alive. The temperature had dropped even further, and I could see my breath misting in the air, swirling around me like some sort of fog. I took a deep breath, my lungs cold with the air that felt almost too sharp. Then, without warning, the figure moved. It wasn't quick, but it was deliberate. It raised one long arm, pointing deeper into the shadows beyond where I stood. "There is no way out." I felt a chill run through me. The weight of those words sank in like a stone in my stomach. The dark hallway, the stairwell that led further underground, was this all a trap? Was I already lost? The figure's form began to waver, like smoke caught in a draft. It flickered in and out of focus, and I wondered if my mind was playing tricks on me. But the sound of its voice was clear, sharp. "You chose the path." I couldn't tell if the words were meant to comfort or warn. They felt like both. The fear in my chest started to rise, clawing at my throat, choking me. The thing in front of me was no longer just a shadow. It was becoming something else. I could feel its presence, no longer an absence, but a force pressing against me. Its shape wavered like a mirage, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw its face, a twisted, pale mask with no features, just a smooth surface of skin that seemed too stretched, too unnatural. I stumbled backward, trying to turn, trying to find a way out of this place. My hand reached for the wall, and I found it, cold, rough stone beneath my fingers. I pushed myself forward, blindly seeking the way back, but the path was gone. The walls around me were shifting, closing in, as though the space itself had become fluid, bending to some unseen force. The very geometry of the place seemed to mock me, as though I were trapped in a dream I couldn't wake up from. I could hear the murmurs again, low and almost inaudible, like a faint whisper behind the walls. The sound seemed to be coming from everywhere, filling the space with a growing sense of unease. I couldn't make out the words, but the feeling they carried was unmistakable, a warning, or perhaps a promise of something worse. "You are lost now." The voice was closer, sharper. I turned around, desperate for something familiar, but there was nothing. Only shadows, and that figure, its empty eyes staring at me. I ran. I ran blindly through the dark, my footsteps echoing off the stone, the sound of my own breath filling my ears. But no matter how fast I moved, the dark space seemed to stretch endlessly before me, and the walls, they seemed to press closer. The air felt thick and heavy, as though I were wading through it, and every step I took was a struggle, as if the place itself was trying to hold me back. And then I saw it. A faint light, a glimmer in the distance. My heart leapt. It was so small, barely visible, but it was enough. The door, the way out. I sprinted toward it, feeling my legs burn with the effort, but the farther I ran, the further away it seemed to become. The light grew dimmer, as though being swallowed by the darkness, and no matter how much I pushed myself, I couldn't reach it. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled, falling to my knees. My breathing was ragged, my chest tightening as I struggled to make sense of what was happening. This couldn't be real. There had to be a way out. But the figure was there again, standing between me and the light. "You are here now," it said, its voice colder than before, "and you will never leave." I felt my chest tighten, my heartbeat speeding up. It wasn't just a figure, it was everything. The walls, the air, the very space itself. It was all part of it, all part of the trap. The path I had walked, there had never been a way out. There never would be. My mind screamed in defiance, but the truth had already settled into my bones. This place wasn't just a building. It was something else. Something older, something wrong. And I was just another lost soul trapped in its web. The figure's form grew larger, enveloping me in its shadow. "You are part of it now," it whispered, "and so are the others." The whispering grew louder, drowning out everything else. And I realized, with a sickening certainty, that the show had never ended. The lights hadn't dimmed. It had only begun. The whispering never stopped. It filled my ears like a swarm of insects, buzzing incessantly, muffled and distant, but unbearably close at the same time. I tried to cover my ears, but my hands felt useless, as though they belonged to someone else. Every move I made felt sluggish, unnatural. The cold was unbearable now, seeping into my bones, freezing me from the inside out. I had to move. But where? Every direction seemed wrong, every choice leading to the same place. The light ahead of me was gone now, completely swallowed by the shadows. The figure stood still, unmoving, but I could feel its presence growing, filling every corner of this underground labyrinth. The walls seemed to pulse, like the heartbeat of some massive, unseen creature. I took another step, the sound of my footsteps far too loud in the silence, the only sound besides the constant hum of whispers. My breath fogged in front of me, the cold air scraping against my skin, but I couldn't escape it. The darkness around me was tightening, its grip like the hands of 1,000 ghosts, pulling me deeper into the unknown. "You can't leave," the figure's voice echoed again, more insistent now, like the words were branded into my mind. I turned, desperate to get away, but the hallway stretched endlessly in both directions. The space seemed to fold in on itself, a maze that had no exit. Every turn, every corner, led to more walls, more shadows. I could feel the weight of the place pressing down on me, as though the very structure of the building had become alive, watching me, waiting. "You chose this," it said again, and I could feel the words sinking into me, as if they were becoming part of my own thoughts. I couldn't remember how I had ended up here. All I knew was that I had taken a single step, a step that had led me into this nightmare. I reached for the walls again, the cold stone beneath my fingers sending a shiver up my arm. The texture of it felt wrong, too smooth, almost slippery, as though it was trying to wriggle away from my touch. And then I saw it. A doorway, small, almost insignificant, tucked away in the corner of the hallway. It was nothing like the red door from before, no visible markings or instructions. Just a plain wooden door, slightly ajar, leading into another dark room. I didn't want to go near it. But there was something about it, a pull, like a force beyond my control. I couldn't look away. With a deep breath, I forced myself to walk toward it, each step heavier than the last. The whispers were louder now, more frantic, like a million voices all speaking at once, too fast to make sense of. I reached the door, my hand trembling as I pushed it open. Inside, it was a small room, barren except for a single object placed in the center. A mirror. It stood tall and imposing, the edges cracked and jagged, as though it had been shattered and poorly repaired. The reflection was distorted, the glass rippling like water, as if the mirror itself were a portal to something else. I couldn't resist. I stepped closer, my heart racing in my chest. The reflection that stared back at me wasn't my own. It was a version of me, pale, ghostly, eyes wide with fear, lips curled in a silent scream. But it wasn't just the look of terror on its face that froze me. It was the way it moved. It wasn't mimicking my movements. No, it was watching me. And when I blinked, it smiled. I stumbled back, but the reflection didn't move. It stayed there, smiling at me with an unsettling calm, as though it were waiting for something. Then I heard a sound, a soft creaking noise, like a door opening. I turned around, and there, in the corner of the room, a dark, narrow passageway had appeared, just beyond the edge of the mirror. The air in the room grew even colder, and the whispering grew louder, more desperate. "It's waiting for you." I couldn't see what was in the passage. I didn't want to look. But somehow, I was being drawn to it, my body moving without my permission. The figure from earlier was gone now, but I could feel its presence, still looming over me, watching. Every inch of the space around me seemed to throb with an unsettling energy. The air tasted metallic, and I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, thumping louder and louder, as if it, too, were being pulled toward whatever lay beyond that passage. I hesitated, my feet rooted to the cold floor. My mind screamed for me to run, to escape, to find the way out before it was too late. But the passage, the mirror, everything about this place was calling to me, pulling me deeper, urging me to follow it. And against everything in me, I stepped forward. The moment I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me. The room vanished in an instant, replaced by an endless stretch of hallway that seemed to twist and fold in on itself. The walls were now slick and wet, like they were alive, pulsing with some unseen energy. The whispers became screams. "No one leaves." I looked behind me. The mirror, the doorway, gone. I was alone now, truly alone. The air was heavy, and I could barely see in the dark, but I felt the presence of something, someone, just out of sight. Something was waiting in the shadows. Something that had always been there. And I was walking straight into its grasp. The darkness closed in around me like a blanket, smothering every sense but one, the oppressive weight of the silence. I could hear nothing but my own breath, shallow and ragged, and the pounding of my heart, louder now than the whispers. The walls had become slick, their surfaces cold and wet, as if the very structure of the building was sweating in the darkness, trying to expel me. I could almost feel the air thickening around me, pulling at my skin, whispering that I didn't belong here. Every step I took felt heavier. The hall seemed endless, stretching forward, expanding with each turn I made, as though the architecture itself was alive, reshaping to trap me. The ground beneath me was uneven, a constant reminder that nothing was real here. Nothing followed the rules I knew. No up, no down, no left, no right. A sudden creak shattered the silence, like a door opening in the distance. My eyes darted toward it, but all I saw was the thick, oppressive blackness that filled the space ahead. Still, I couldn't ignore the pull. The door wasn't real. It couldn't be. Yet, something deep inside urged me to move toward it. I had no choice but to follow. As I drew closer, I could see that the door, though battered and old, seemed to be exactly where I needed to go. It felt like a promise, a fleeting hope in the otherwise consuming void. The wood of the door was cracked, the paint peeling as though it had been untouched for years. I reached for the handle, my fingers trembling as they closed around the cold metal. Just as I was about to open it, I heard it again. The whisper, "You're not supposed to leave." I froze, the words hanging in the air like a curse. I wanted to pull away, to run, but my hand was already on the door. My body wasn't mine anymore. It was moving on its own, driven by something deeper than fear, deeper than reason. I twisted the handle. The door opened with a groan, revealing a long corridor that stretched beyond what my eyes could make sense of. The edges of the walls faded into the blackness, swallowed up by shadows that didn't make sense, as though the darkness were infinite, a void that stretched on forever. I stepped through, though every part of me screamed to turn back. There was no turning back now. The moment I crossed the threshold, I could feel it. The air changed. The very atmosphere felt heavier, like I had stepped into a different world altogether. The hallway was narrow, lined with doors that were slightly ajar. The walls were uneven, jagged, as if the building itself had been built in haste. The floors creaked under my feet, old wood groaning in protest. But there was something else in the air, something that couldn't be explained. A flicker of movement at the corner of my eye. A shadow that darted just beyond my field of vision. "You cannot leave." The voice was closer now, almost breathing down my neck. I spun around, heart racing, but there was nothing. Only the deep, overwhelming darkness. Yet, I could feel the presence, like 1,000 unseen eyes watching me, waiting for me to falter. The whispers grew louder. They were no longer distant murmurs, but voices, real voices, layered, as if a crowd of people were speaking at once. They surrounded me, their words unintelligible but full of malice. I quickened my pace, moving down the hallway, hoping to find an escape, a way out, but the corridor seemed to stretch infinitely. No matter how far I went, the doors never seemed to end, and the whispers never ceased. Then, I saw it. A figure at the end of the hallway, standing still in the shadows. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its gaze locked on me, piercing through the darkness like a spear. "It's not real," the voice whispered. "None of this is real." I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but my voice caught in my throat. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, motionless. And as I walked closer, I saw that it wasn't a person. It was something else. Something wrong. A silhouette, hunched, twisted, its limbs too long, its shape too deformed to be human. The hallway seemed to stretch even further as I moved toward it, each step feeling like I was walking through thick mud. The light around me flickered. "You have no choice now," the voice continued, rising in pitch, a crescendo of madness. I was close enough now to make out the details. The figure was hunched over, its arms impossibly long, and its head was tilted at an angle, as if it was studying me. The closer I got, the more I realized that its face was a blur, a smudged, black void with no eyes, no mouth, no features. Just darkness where a person's face should be. The whispering stopped abruptly. I was frozen. Suddenly, the figure moved, not in a way a person should. It didn't walk. It shifted, bending and twisting, its limbs extending unnaturally as it closed the distance between us in an instant. I stumbled backward, gasping, my heart hammering in my chest. But the hallway seemed to close in on me. The walls were pressing in, narrowing, and the door at the end was now gone. The figure loomed in front of me, its distorted, faceless form blocking my escape. There was nowhere left to run. I could feel its presence suffocating me, and I knew, with sickening clarity, that it was here to claim me. I was trapped. There was no escape. Not from the figure, not from this place. I could feel the ground beneath me shift again, as if it were swallowing me whole. And just as I thought it would consume me entirely, the darkness opened up, and I was falling. But I didn't hit the ground. I was weightless, floating. And in that moment, I realized the truth. There was no way out. This wasn't just a building. It was a prison, a place that existed outside of time, outside of reality. And I was a part of it now. I was falling, but it felt like time itself had stopped. The darkness swallowed me whole, and my body, suspended in this void, didn't know whether it was moving or still. I couldn't tell if I was breathing, but the silence pressed in so hard that it felt like the weight of the universe was pressing down on me. Everything around me was empty. No walls, no floors, just an endless, black abyss. Then, something changed. I felt the ground beneath my feet, solid and cold. The sensation was jarring, like being pulled out of a dream. My eyes snapped open, and for a moment, I couldn't recognize where I was. I was standing in the center of a vast, dimly lit room. The air was thick, heavy with dust, but strangely, there was no musty odor. No smell at all. I spun around, trying to take in my surroundings, but the room stretched endlessly in every direction, the walls barely visible in the low light, the corners blending into more shadows. My heart raced. The room felt familiar, like I had been here before, but I couldn't place it. Then I saw it. A stage. A grand stage at the far end of the room, bathed in soft light. The curtains, though old and tattered, hung with the elegance of a long-forgotten performance. The wooden floorboards, worn smooth by years of use, reflected a dim, ghostly glow. My legs moved on their own accord, carrying me toward it, even though every instinct told me to run. As I approached, I noticed something else. The audience. Rows upon rows of empty seats, yet they felt occupied. It was as though invisible eyes were watching, scrutinizing every move I made, every step I took toward the stage. My heart pounded harder, and a wave of nausea washed over me. The air grew thick again, as if I was suffocating in this oppressive presence. It was then that I understood the audience wasn't empty. They were just hidden, watching. My legs trembled, but I couldn't stop myself. I had to see what was on the stage. I stepped onto the wooden floor, and it groaned under my weight, a sound too real in the hollow space. The lights above flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the room, warping the shapes around me. I was standing on the stage now, unable to move, unable to breathe. I felt small, insignificant, as though the entire room had turned its attention on me, waiting for something. Waiting for me to act. The air shifted again. A cold breeze brushed against my skin, and I turned, only to see a figure in the shadows. A figure I knew all too well. The faceless entity. It stood at the far side of the stage, watching me with its blank, soulless gaze. Its presence filled the space, suffocating every inch of it, and I could feel it pushing against me, as though it were trying to invade my mind, my very thoughts. You shouldn't have come, it whispered, the voice not in my ears but in my mind. You can never leave. I opened my mouth to scream, but the words didn't come. The figure moved closer, its limbs distorting, elongating as it advanced. I could hear the creaking of bones, the snapping of joints as it came closer, its unnatural movements forcing me to back away. My heart raced faster than ever, and every cell in my body screamed at me to run, to get away, but my legs refused to obey. I was frozen. The audience, those invisible eyes, watched silently, their presence an unspoken demand. They were waiting for something, and I was the one who would have to provide it. There was no other choice. The figure was almost on top of me now, its faceless head tilting, as if inspecting me. I could feel the cold, oppressive weight of its gaze even though there were no eyes, no face, just that void of nothingness. You can't escape, it repeated, its voice a cacophony of whispers. This is your fate. It was then that I noticed something, a faint shimmer of light in the corner of my eye. My mind screamed at me to look away, to not acknowledge it, but I couldn't help myself. It was the ticket. The same ticket I had bought for the theater, now fluttering in the air beside me. It had appeared out of nowhere, as if drawn from the very fabric of the room itself. The words on the ticket shifted and morphed as if they were alive, constantly changing. I couldn't make sense of it until the letters finally stopped, settling into a single phrase. Exit, this way. The words burned into my mind. The exit was there, I could almost feel it, but the figure moved faster now, its inhuman speed closing the gap between us. The ground beneath me began to crack, and the room trembled as though the entire building was on the verge of collapsing. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the very walls were screaming for me to stay, to accept my fate. But the ticket was still there, the exit within my grasp. I took a step toward it. Then another. And another. But the room continued to distort, the walls closing in, and the shadows reached for me, clawing at my mind, pulling me back. The figure was right behind me now, its breath, or was it a whisper, hissing in my ear. I couldn't stop. I ran. The world around me began to warp as I sprinted toward the ticket, my hands trembling as I reached out for it, desperate to escape. The stage was vanishing behind me, the audience fading into nothing, and the figure, that terrible, faceless thing, was losing its hold on me. Finally, I touched the ticket. Everything went silent. The world shattered like glass. I opened my eyes, and I was outside, in the cold night air. Alone. The theater was gone. The city street stretched out before me, unchanged. The crowd bustled around me, unaware of the nightmare I had just escaped. But I knew something had changed. I had been part of something beyond the bounds of reality, something I wasn't meant to witness. And as I looked down at my hand, still trembling, I saw it. The ticket. The same ticket. But this time, the words on it were different. Exit, forever. I was free, but I would never escape the shadow of the theater. Have you ever wondered what could happen in the brief moments when you're not paying attention? When the ordinary world slips away and something unusual slips into its place? I didn't know it at the time, but that day, on that bus, I was about to find out. It was a long journey, one of those long-haul bus rides that you take to escape the ordinary, to get lost in the landscape as it blurs past. It had been hours, and the sun had started to dip behind the trees, casting the world in golden shadows. We were all exhausted, half sleeping, half watching the scenery when the bus pulled over at a rest stop. It was a typical break, no different from 1,000 others. A small, empty lot with a few benches and a tiny convenience shop. The kind of place where everyone steps out, stretches their legs, buys a drink, and then gets back on the road. But one of the passengers didn't come back. His name was Tom. I didn't know him well, but I noticed him during the trip. He was sitting a few rows ahead of me, a quiet man with dark hair and a look in his eyes that said he wasn't fully present. There was something about him that felt off. Not dangerous, but strange. The way he looked at the scenery out the window, as though it wasn't real. When the bus doors opened at the stop, most of the passengers shuffled out, stretching and chatting. I decided to stay seated for a few moments, not feeling like moving. The hum of the engine was like a lullaby, and the warmth of the bus made it hard to want to leave. I glanced over at Tom's seat. Empty. No sign of him. At first, I thought he had gone inside the shop, but as the minutes passed, I began to notice the others, who were now returning to the bus, looking at the empty seat with confused glances. I thought it was strange. Tom wasn't the type to wander off without a word, and the stop was only supposed to last for 15 minutes. The bus driver gave a quick scan of the parking lot, shrugged, and closed the doors. We were just about to pull away when I saw it. A small notebook lying neatly on Tom's seat as if he had left it there on purpose. It was a cheap, worn-out thing, one of those notebooks that could be found in any store. But it was the pages inside that caught my attention. I couldn't explain why, but I picked it up. I flipped it open, expecting it to be filled with the usual, unremarkable scrawl of a passenger's notes, maybe directions or thoughts to pass the time. But what I found inside was anything but ordinary. The pages were covered with strange writing. Words jumbled together, some written in pencil, others scratched out, some barely legible. It wasn't a story, not even a list of things, just fragmented thoughts, like a man trying to grasp onto something that kept slipping away. Find the second door. It's hidden. They watch us. Not safe. Not safe. They're everywhere. The noise is coming. Can't escape. I stopped reading for a moment, my hands trembling. My stomach churned. Something about it felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to see it. The words seemed too frantic, too full of dread, as if whoever had written them was desperately trying to communicate something before it was too late. I looked out the window, as if expecting to see Tom standing there, watching me. But the parking lot was empty. It was getting late, and the shadows were growing longer. I could feel my pulse quickening. I handed the notebook to the bus driver. Did anyone see where he went? I asked. The driver, a gruff man who didn't look the type to care much about passengers, glanced at me and then at the empty seat. He shrugged. I didn't see him go inside. Maybe he went for a walk. He was acting strange earlier. He said it with a note of indifference, but there was something in his tone that made my skin crawl. I didn't like it. There was a growing sense of unease, something I couldn't shake. The others were settling back in, and the driver was starting the engine, but I couldn't let go of that notebook. I couldn't ignore the words scribbled across the pages, the frantic ramblings that seemed to speak of something I couldn't understand. As the bus pulled back onto the road, I glanced at the notebook again, my heart pounding. Something told me that this wasn't just a random disappearance. Something had happened to Tom, something that had left behind this trail of cryptic warnings. And I was about to find out what. I just hoped I wasn't too late. The ride felt different now, quieter somehow. The hum of the bus, which had once been comforting, now seemed suffocating. My eyes kept drifting back to the notebook in my hands. The more I read, the more it unsettled me. Tom had left these pages behind as though they were a map, a warning. The thought that something could happen to me too, something I couldn't understand or fight, gnawed at the back of my mind. As the bus rumbled down the highway, I tried to shake the feeling that I was being watched. The other passengers had settled into their seats, some talking, some asleep, but it felt like the air had changed. The muffled conversations, the creaking of the bus, all sounded distant, like I was in a dream. I flipped through the notebook again. Each page was more unsettling than the last. There was a recurring phrase, repeated over and over, "The door is always closed." I stared at the words. What door? What was Tom trying to tell me? I glanced around the bus, my eyes locking with those of a woman sitting across the aisle. She had been looking at me for a while, and her expression was unreadable. As I caught her gaze, she quickly turned away, but not before I saw the slight shudder that passed through her. I wasn't the only one who felt it. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't just in my head. The bus driver's voice crackled over the intercom, breaking my trance. Next stop in 15 minutes, he announced, his tone flat, uninterested. Make sure you're ready. The sudden interruption only made my anxiety worse. The other passengers stirred, preparing to get off. But my mind was elsewhere. The notebook was still in my hands, and I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was about to happen. I shoved the notebook into my bag and stood up, my legs shaky. I needed air. I needed to think. The bus was slowing down as we approached another rest area. The lights flickered outside, casting long shadows on the pavement. The building where we stopped was small, almost deserted. A gas station, a few benches, and a stretch of empty road that led into the darkness. I made my way outside, trying to shake off the tension building in my chest. The others were already getting off, heading toward the convenience store or sitting on the benches, chatting idly. I stepped away from the group, trying to clear my head. The night was cool, the air fresh, but it didn't calm me. I could still hear the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. My eyes kept scanning the surroundings, expecting to see something, someone, anything. But the area remained eerily still, silent except for the low hum of the bus engine idling behind me. And then I saw it. A figure standing near the edge of the lot, just outside the reach of the lights. I couldn't make out details, just a shape, a shadow in the dark. My breath caught in my throat. The figure was standing motionless, staring in my direction. I froze. For a moment, I thought it might be Tom. But no! This person's posture was too rigid, too unnatural. I stepped back, my body moving on its own, a reflex to escape. But just as I was about to turn and head back toward the bus, the figure moved. Slowly. Unnaturally. Not a step, but a glide. As if the person wasn't walking, but floating. I turned and ran back toward the bus, not daring to look behind me. The sound of my footsteps was swallowed by the eerie silence of the night. I reached the bus door and slammed it shut behind me, my chest heaving. The bus driver looked up from his seat, his expression unreadable. He didn't say anything. Just started the engine. I took a seat and tried to calm myself, my heart still racing. I wasn't sure what I had seen. It could have been nothing. But the fear in my gut told me otherwise. As the bus pulled back onto the road, the landscape blurred past the window again. The passengers had returned to their seats, some talking, some dozing off. The hum of the bus was a dull roar in the background, but it wasn't enough to drown out the thoughts in my mind. The figure, the notebook, Tom's disappearance. It was all connected. The fear that had started with Tom's notebook was now spreading through me, wrapping around my chest like a vice. What was happening on this bus? Was I next? Or had I already crossed some line I couldn't come back from? The lights inside the bus flickered. Once. Twice. And then, for a split second, everything went dark. The bus jolted, and the world seemed to hold its breath. I could hear the passengers shifting in their seats, muttering in confusion. The lights came back on just as quickly as they had gone out, but something had changed. The air was heavier now, thick with unease. I looked around, and it felt like the passengers were all staring at me, their eyes blank, their faces too still. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in the last few seconds. Something was wrong, and I was getting closer to the truth. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the truth might be something I couldn't survive. The feeling didn't leave me. It grew, intensifying with every minute, every second I sat in my seat, surrounded by silent, motionless passengers. My fingers gripped the edge of my seat, my knuckles turning white. The air inside the bus felt colder, heavier, like we were moving through some other place, somewhere I shouldn't be. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The flickering lights, the strange figure in the dark, just stress, nothing more. The bus had been on the road for a while now. The steady rhythm of the wheels on the asphalt should have been soothing, but instead, it only seemed to accentuate the unease. I glanced around again. The passengers were eerily still, as if they weren't real. They were just waiting. But for what? For me to notice something? To understand? I opened the notebook once more, my hands trembling as I flipped through the pages. Tom's words had become more erratic the further I read. She knows, one page read. The door is waiting. I slammed the book shut, but the words lingered in my mind. What door? What did it all mean? The bus suddenly lurched to the side, throwing me against the window. I gasped, looking up, my heart pounding. The driver's face was barely visible through the rearview mirror, but his expression was unreadable. I couldn't hear anything over the engine, but I could feel the tension in the air, thick and palpable. And then, without warning, the bus came to a halt. The silence that followed was deafening. No one moved. Not a sound. My breath hitched in my throat, and I stood up, legs unsteady, moving almost involuntarily toward the front of the bus. The rest of the passengers remained seated, as if nothing was out of the ordinary. I made my way to the driver's cabin. The door was closed, but not locked. I pushed it open. The driver was gone. I froze. His seat was empty, the cabin eerily quiet. The steering wheel sat still, unmoving, as if the bus had simply been abandoned in the middle of nowhere. My eyes scanned the space, looking for any sign of him, but there was nothing. Hello? I called out, my voice shaking. No response. The bus was moving again, the wheels still turning. But who was driving? My panic spiked. I turned back to the aisle, my breath coming in shallow bursts. Every passenger was still in their seat, but now their faces seemed wrong. Their eyes, wide open, were fixed on me, staring with unnerving intensity. Their bodies were rigid, unmoving. I stumbled back toward my seat, barely managing to stay upright. The bus kept moving, but it was no longer a journey I recognized. It felt like we were gliding, floating on a path that didn't belong to this world. I had to get out. I pushed open the door at the rear of the bus, hoping for a glimpse of anything familiar. The air outside was thick with fog. A heavy mist had rolled in, obscuring the road. It felt like the world outside was closing in on me, suffocating. And then I saw it. A building in the distance, barely visible through the haze. It stood tall, dark, like something forgotten, like a shadow of something that never should have existed. The fog seemed to part just enough for me to make out the silhouette of an old, crumbling theater. The structure loomed large, its windows dark and empty. But it wasn't the theater that drew my attention. It was the door. The door Tom had mentioned in the notebook. It was standing open, beckoning, waiting. I didn't think. I couldn't think. The urge to go to that door was overwhelming, like a magnetic pull, dragging me toward it. I stepped down from the bus, my feet hitting the wet ground with a dull thud. The air was cold, biting, but it didn't matter. I had to go. I had to see what was on the other side. I walked toward the theater, each step taking me further from the bus, from the safety of the known. The fog was thicker now, wrapping around me like a cold, wet blanket. The sounds of the bus faded behind me, replaced by the soft, eerie whispers of the wind. The door loomed larger with every step, and when I reached it, I hesitated. The darkness inside seemed endless, but something inside me urged me to enter. Without a second thought, I stepped through the threshold. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of dust and old wood. I could hear the faintest creaking, as if the building itself was alive, groaning in protest. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, and I realized I was standing in a long hallway, the walls covered in peeling wallpaper. And then, as if the building itself had recognized my presence, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my heart racing. I was trapped. But there was no time to panic. The hallway stretched ahead, dark and seemingly endless, but my feet were already moving, driven by something I couldn't understand. I had to keep going, had to find the answers. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. Slow. Deliberate. But they weren't mine. I froze, my blood running cold. The footsteps grew louder, coming closer. Someone, or something, was following me. I didn't wait. I ran. My heart thudded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears as I ran through the hallway, the sound of my footsteps now mingling with the rhythmic thud of the approaching ones. They were getting closer, too close. The air in the building felt suffocating, pressing against my skin as if the walls themselves were closing in. The dim light from the flickering bulbs above cast strange shadows on the cracked walls, distorting the space around me, making it feel like the very hallway was shifting, warping. I turned a corner, my breath ragged and desperate. The footsteps behind me paused for a moment, and I dared to glance back over my shoulder. The hallway was empty. My eyes scanned the shadows, heart pounding in my throat. I could still hear it, the echo of footsteps that seemed to bounce off the walls, though there was no one there. It was impossible, but I could feel it, the presence that stalked me, ever so slightly behind, always just out of reach. I pressed forward, ignoring the creeping panic that threatened to take over. The hallway stretched before me, seemingly endless, and every door I passed was locked, the handles cold and unyielding beneath my touch. My mind raced, trying to remember what had happened back at the bus. Had I imagined it all? Was I losing my mind? Or had I stepped into something, somewhere, that wasn't supposed to exist? Another sharp turn, and the hallway opened into a large, grand theater. The room was vast and dark, the air thick with the smell of decay and forgotten memories. The rows of old, dust-covered seats stretched in front of me, empty, as though no one had sat there in years. The stage loomed in the distance, a black void that swallowed any light that reached it. And there, at the center of the stage, was a single figure. It was a man, tall and cloaked in shadow. I couldn't make out his face, but I could feel his gaze, heavy and oppressive, fixed on me. He stood motionless, as if waiting for me. My legs refused to move, frozen in place by an overwhelming sense of dread. This was the man I had been hearing in the darkness, the one whose footsteps had echoed behind me. A voice, low and gravelly, broke the silence. "You've come." I didn't answer. I couldn't. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with meaning, a weight that pressed down on me from all sides. The figure stepped forward, his movements slow, deliberate, as though savoring every moment. My breath hitched, and I instinctively took a step back. But I couldn't escape. The theater had become a trap, and I was the prey. "What do you want?" I forced the words out, my voice trembling. The figure stopped. There was a long pause before he spoke again, and when he did, his voice was softer, almost too soft to hear, as if it were a whisper from somewhere deep inside the building. "You were never meant to find this place. But now that you have," he trailed off, the silence stretching between us. I took another step back, my heart pounding in my chest. The fear was almost unbearable now, tightening around my throat, making it hard to breathe. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused to move. I was rooted to the spot, caught in the gaze of the figure on the stage. "You should have left when you had the chance," he murmured, his eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. I wanted to scream, to fight, to do anything, but my body felt heavy, numb. Something in the air had shifted, like the very fabric of reality had begun to unravel. The figure stepped closer, and I felt an icy chill wash over me, like the temperature in the room had dropped several degrees in an instant. My hands shook as I reached for the door behind me, the cold metal handle now seeming impossibly far away. I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. His presence was magnetic, pulling me in despite every instinct screaming to run. Then, as I touched the door, the sound of a deep, guttural laugh echoed through the theater. It wasn't a human laugh, not in any sense I knew. It felt wrong, unnatural, like it came from the walls themselves. "You don't get to leave," the figure whispered. And in that moment, the lights flickered out. The world around me went black, and I felt the floor beneath my feet give way. My body tumbled through the darkness, my arms flailing as I struggled to grasp onto something, anything. But there was nothing. The darkness swallowed me whole, and the last thing I heard before everything went silent was the sound of the door slamming shut, locking me in. The quiet stretched on, empty and endless. I woke to the sound of my own voice, whispering in the dark. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a dream at all. The silence was deafening. My eyes slowly adjusted to the faint light that surrounded me. I was no longer in the theater. The air was different, colder, and thinner, as if I had been transported to a place far from where I started. My hands trembled as I reached out, brushing against what felt like stone walls. It was damp here, the kind of wetness that seeped into your bones, making you shiver involuntarily. I tried to move, but my body felt sluggish, like I was wading through thick, viscous air. Every step I took seemed to echo through the emptiness, the sound distorting, as though the very space I was in didn't quite align with reality. I tried to breathe normally, but the air felt wrong. Heavy. Dense. And then I heard it. A whisper. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks, a trickle of sound that my brain was trying to make sense of. But then it grew louder, clearer, like a voice that had always been here, waiting for me to listen. You're not alone. I spun around, but there was no one there. Just the cold, damp stone walls closing in on me, the shadows stretching unnaturally in the dim light. My heart began to race again, my pulse pounding in my ears. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. This place, whatever it was, wasn't supposed to exist. But there it was. A reality so warped, so alien, that it made everything I had known feel like a distant memory, a dream I might never wake up from. Another whisper. Turn around. I didn't want to. I knew I shouldn't. But something inside me compelled me to. Slowly, I turned. And there, standing at the far end of the hallway, was the figure. The one from the stage. He was no longer a mere shadow. His form was clearer now, though still shrouded in an unsettling darkness. His eyes glowed faintly, two orbs of pale, flickering light that burned with an unnatural intensity. The space around him seemed to warp, like reality itself was bending to accommodate his presence. You've come far. His voice was soft, almost too soft to hear, but it echoed in the emptiness, filling the vastness of the space around me. But you're still not ready. Ready for what? I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. I had to get out of here. I had to find a way back. The figure took a step forward, his movements slow, deliberate. He didn't walk, he glided, like he was floating just above the ground, his feet never quite touching the floor. Each movement was unnatural, as though he existed in a state between worlds. You've crossed into a place where the rules no longer apply. Time doesn't exist here. Space doesn't exist here. He paused, his gaze never leaving me. And you will never leave here. The words hit me like a physical blow, sending a jolt of terror through my body. I stumbled backward, instinctively reaching for the door behind me, except it wasn't there anymore. The hallway stretched on in both directions, endless and oppressive. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced, but there was no escape, no way out. The figure took another step closer, and the room seemed to darken further, the shadows lengthening until they consumed the light. You should have never followed the instructions, he continued, his voice almost pitying. Now, you belong to this place. Forever. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. The floor beneath me felt like it was sinking, warping, like it was trying to swallow me whole. Panic surged, clawing at my chest. I glanced around wildly, but all I saw was the darkness closing in. And then, from the depths of the shadowy space, a faint glow appeared, small at first, like a distant star, and then it grew brighter, illuminating the figure. But as the light grew, so did the fear in my chest. The light wasn't real. It was just another illusion. The figure smiled. It wasn't a smile I recognized. It was cold, twisted, like something ancient and forgotten. You're here now, he whispered again, his voice distant but unmistakably real. And you will stay. Suddenly, the walls around me started to shift, as if the very architecture was alive, pulsating with energy. The hallway I stood in, the place that had once seemed so familiar, began to stretch and warp, like it was being sucked into a vortex. Everything was folding inward, crumpling like paper, as if it could no longer hold the shape of reality. I reached out, desperate to hold onto something, anything, but there was nothing solid, nothing to anchor me. My mind screamed, my body screamed, but all I could do was watch as the darkness consumed me whole. And in the end, there was nothing left but the silence. The silence of a place that had never truly existed. The silence of the other side. Have you ever answered a phone call only to hear a voice that makes no sense, yet somehow feels eerily familiar? I didn't believe it was possible, not in the way that I experienced it. It was a normal morning at the office. The kind of morning where everything seems to blur into one, the hum of the fluorescent lights, the constant clicking of keyboards, and the low murmur of coworkers discussing reports or deadlines. I was sitting at my desk, sipping my lukewarm coffee, scrolling through the endless emails that filled my inbox. Nothing unusual. Nothing at all. And then, the phone rang. It wasn't particularly loud, but it cut through the monotony of the office like a sudden jolt to the system. I glanced at the screen. The number was unfamiliar, just a series of digits that didn't ring any bells. I hesitated for a moment. I wasn't in the mood for a telemarketer, but something made me pick up. "Hello?" I said, my voice slightly more fatigued than usual. The voice on the other end didn't sound urgent or frantic, just calm. Too calm. "Do you remember what happened 5 years ago?" The voice asked, the words lingering in the air. I froze. A chill ran down my spine. The question felt wrong. It felt like it had been plucked from some forgotten part of my life. Something deep in my memory stirred, but I couldn't place it. My fingers tightened around the receiver as I tried to force my thoughts into clarity. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice now shaky, uncertain. The voice didn't answer that question. Instead, it spoke again, as if oblivious to my discomfort. "It's been 5 years. You don't remember, do you? You don't remember what you did." My heart skipped a beat. A creeping sense of unease filled the space around me. What was this? What was this person talking about? "What do you mean?" I managed to croak out. I could feel the sweat on the back of my neck, a feeling I hadn't experienced in years. This wasn't a normal phone call. It couldn't be. There was a brief silence on the other end. A quiet shuffle of paper, perhaps, or a distant hum. And then, the voice continued, each word making my stomach twist. "You should have never opened that door." The phone line clicked, and the call abruptly ended. My hand was still gripping the receiver, but the connection was dead. The hum of the office returned to fill the silence, but it didn't feel the same anymore. The world seemed dimmer, more distant, like something was subtly off. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. I stared at the phone, my thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and fear. The voice had said something about 5 years ago, about a door. But what door? I couldn't remember anything that made sense. I had no memory of any significant event, no clue what this was all about. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was some prank. Maybe it was a mistake, some random wrong number. But I couldn't dismiss the feeling, the sensation that something was deeply wrong. My fingers automatically reached for the office phone's call log. I needed to check the details. Maybe there was some clue. But when I scrolled through the list of incoming calls, I froze. The call wasn't there. I scrolled again. Nothing. No trace. The screen showed no record of the call that had just come through. It was as if the conversation had never happened at all. I looked around the office, trying to shake the unease, but it was there. That feeling. The one that tells you something is off, but you can't figure out what. I told myself it was nothing. It had to be nothing. A mistake. A glitch. But I couldn't stop the knot in my stomach from tightening. The office was the same, but it didn't feel the same. The walls seemed a little too close, the hum of the lights just a bit too loud. I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched, as though something, or someone, was waiting. Watching. I couldn't concentrate after that. I tried to focus on my work, but the words on the screen blurred. Every phone ring made my heart race. Every movement in the corner of my eye made me jump. There was no logical reason for this, no explanation that made sense. But as the hours dragged on, I began to feel it. That sense of creeping dread. Something from the past, something I had buried deep, was resurfacing. And it was coming for me. The next few days felt like a nightmare, but one that I couldn't wake up from. Every time the phone rang, I felt a rush of panic. I couldn't help it. My eyes would dart to the screen, praying it wasn't that number again, the one I didn't recognize, the one that had no record. But it didn't stop there. I started hearing things. Small things, at first. A faint sound of footsteps echoing in the hallway, a door creaking when no one was near it. Each time I checked, the halls would be empty. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving, something was watching, something was following me. I began avoiding the phone, keeping it off the hook when I could. My coworkers noticed, of course. They asked if I was okay, why I looked so pale, so jittery. I brushed it off, claiming I was just tired. But I couldn't stop thinking about the call, the words that haunted me. You should have never opened that door. What door? What could they have meant? It wasn't until the following week that I found the answer. I had been spending most of my time avoiding work, obsessing over the mystery of the call. I scoured my memory for anything related to a door, any significant door in my life. There had to be something. But the more I searched, the more it felt like I was digging into a deep well that only led to darkness. There was nothing. No answers. But then, one afternoon, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. I was sitting at my desk when I happened to glance at the far wall of the office. The door, the one leading to the supply closet, was slightly ajar. It had always been closed, locked when not in use, and I had never thought much about it. But now, there it was, open just enough for me to see the darkness beyond. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling that washed over me, but I couldn't. I got from my desk and walked toward it, my footsteps seeming far too loud in the quiet office. My hand reached for the door handle, and I froze just before I turned it. Something, an instinct, perhaps, told me not to. It was then that I realized what was wrong. I had never seen that door open. Ever. Not in all the years I had worked here. The supply closet was always locked, always shut tight. But somehow, today it was ajar, like it had been waiting for me. Waiting for me to notice. I quickly stepped back, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. My mind raced as I tried to rationalize it. Someone must have left it open. Someone had to have unlocked it by accident. But as I stood there, staring at the darkened gap between the door and its frame, I realized something else. The air felt heavier around it, as though it was pulling the very light from the room. The silence seemed too thick, too suffocating. Without thinking, I grabbed the nearest object, a stapler, and tossed it toward the door. It hit the floor with a soft thud, but nothing happened. No movement. No sounds. The door just sat there, open, as if nothing had changed. I waited for a moment, heart racing, and then something caught my eye. There, just beyond the door, was something written on the wall. In dark, smudged letters, scrawled across the paint as if someone had hurriedly written it in a panic, were words I'd never seen before. It's always been here. Don't go through. My blood ran cold. It was in that instant that I understood. The call wasn't just a warning, it was a message. A warning about something much larger, something that had been hiding right beneath the surface of everything. Something I had missed for years. I stepped closer to the door, my hand trembling as I reached for it once more, not sure why, but somehow drawn to it. The moment my fingers touched the cold metal handle, I felt a rush of heat flood my chest. My heart began to race. And just before I turned it, a voice, soft but clear, filled my mind. You should have never opened that door. I pulled my hand away instantly, like the handle had burned me. I stumbled back, knocking over my chair in the process. I gasped for air, feeling the walls closing in on me. The office, once familiar and comforting, felt foreign now. Like it was no longer my place. Like it was a trap. I didn't know what had happened, but I knew one thing for certain. Whatever was on the other side of that door was real. And it had been waiting for me. The next few days were a blur. I barely slept, my mind constantly racing back to that door. The words. The voice. You should have never opened that door. They kept echoing in my head, a whisper that gnawed at me every waking moment. I tried to keep my distance from the supply closet, but I could feel its pull, like it was calling me. Each time I passed it, the urge to open it grew stronger, as if the door was no longer just a physical barrier, but a part of me, waiting for me to make a choice. I couldn't stop thinking about the message written on the wall. It's always been here. Don't go through. What did it mean? And who had written it? The more I pondered, the more the sense of dread grew, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. One night, unable to resist any longer, I decided to confront it. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I knew I had to see what was behind that door, even if it meant risking everything. I left the office after hours, when the building was silent and empty. The light from the overhead bulbs flickered, casting long shadows across the hall. I walked down the corridor, my footsteps echoing in the silence, the air cold against my skin. Each step felt heavier, as though the space around me was becoming thicker, more oppressive. When I reached the door, I stood in front of it for a long moment, my hand hovering just inches from the handle. The silence pressed against me like a weight, suffocating. I could almost hear my heartbeat thudding in my ears, drowning out everything else. I didn't know if I was ready for what I might find, but something deep inside told me I had no choice. I had to know. Taking a deep breath, I turned the handle. The door creaked open with an unsettling sound that echoed through the hall. I stepped inside, my mind racing with questions, my body tensing with fear. The room was dimly lit, the only source of light coming from a flickering bulb in the corner. The space felt impossibly small, as though the walls were closing in with every breath I took. It wasn't just the size of the room that unnerved me. It was the feeling that something was wrong. Like the room didn't belong in the building, like it was out of place, a fragment of something that didn't fit into the world I knew. I moved cautiously toward the center of the room, my eyes scanning the space. It looked like an ordinary storage area, filled with old boxes, stacks of paper, and forgotten office supplies. But then I saw it. In the far corner, hidden behind a pile of boxes, was something that shouldn't have been there. A small, wooden table with a single item resting on it. I approached it slowly, my breath shallow. The item was a photograph, worn and yellowed with age. I reached for it, my fingers trembling as I picked it up. The image was of a man I didn't recognize. He was standing in front of a door, that door, the one I had just opened. But the man, there was something off about him. His eyes were hollow, empty, as if they had seen things no one should ever see. His face was gaunt, pale, almost sickly. I turned the photograph over, hoping for some clue, some explanation. But there was only one word written on the back, in smudged ink. Run. I froze. A cold chill washed over me, and the room seemed to grow colder, the air thicker. I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched, as though something, or someone, was in the room with me. I whirled around, my heart pounding in my chest, but the room was empty. And then I heard it. A faint noise, just at the edge of my hearing. A soft tapping, like footsteps, but impossibly far away. Slowly, it grew louder. Closer. The sound echoed off the walls, reverberating in the silence. My breath caught in my throat. I spun toward the door, but it was gone. Where the door had once been, there was now nothing but an endless wall of darkness. The air grew thick with an oppressive weight, and the room seemed to stretch on forever. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. I was trapped. I stumbled backward, my mind racing for a way out. But there was nothing. No way out. And then, just as I thought I might lose my mind entirely, I heard the voice. Soft, but unmistakable. You should have never opened that door. It was the same voice, the same words, but now they were different. Filled with a cold, sinister edge. The walls around me seemed to close in, the darkness swallowing everything. I could feel it, closing around me, suffocating me. I had made a mistake. I had opened the door, and now I would pay the price. Panic gripped me as I backed away from the darkened space where the door used to be. My heart pounded, each beat a deafening thud in my ears. The voice, that chilling whisper, repeated over and over again, you should have never opened that door. My feet moved instinctively, but the darkness, thick and suffocating, seemed to follow me, creeping along the edges of my vision. I turned frantically, searching for an exit that wasn't there. The room was still, unnervingly still. The once familiar office supplies, the paper stacks, the old furniture, it all now seemed foreign, out of place. The photo I had found on the table was still clutched in my trembling hand, the man's hollow eyes staring up at me as though he were pleading with me to understand. The tapping had stopped, but I could still feel the presence. It lingered, like a shadow just behind me. I could hear my breath quickening, feel the sweat slicking my palms, but I couldn't look away from the emptiness. The oppressive silence pushed in, threatening to crush me. I had to get out of here. I moved toward the far corner of the room, my back pressed against the walls as I tried to find any sign of a door, a window, something to escape through. But the room kept stretching. Every time I took a step, it seemed like the walls closed in a little more. My head spun. Was this real? Or was I losing my grip on reality? Then, I saw it. A faint outline. A doorway, barely visible against the dark wall. With desperation flooding my chest, I moved toward it, every step feeling like a struggle. My breathing grew ragged as I reached for the door. The outline seemed to waver before my eyes, flickering like an illusion. Was this really a way out? Or was it just another trick, another cruel game? I took hold of the handle, my fingers cold and stiff. A chill ran through me as I pushed the door open. The moment the door swung wide, the oppressive air lifted, and I was flooded with light. I stepped out of the room, blinking against the brightness, unsure of where I was. The hallway stretched before me, and I recognized it immediately, the same corridor I'd walked down countless times, the same one that led to the office. But something was off. The place felt different. The floorboards creaked under my feet in a way that wasn't normal. The walls seemed to close in a little more with every step. And then I saw it. The receptionist's desk, but there was no one behind it. It was empty. Confusion tightened in my chest. Why was no one here? It didn't make sense. I should have seen someone. I should have heard someone, but the silence hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I glanced around, but all the doors were closed, the office still and silent. The same office I had left earlier, the same office I had always worked in. But this didn't feel like my office. That's why I saw it. The familiar face. The man from the photograph. He was standing at the end of the hallway, watching me. His eyes, cold and empty, stared directly at me, just like they had in the photo. I froze. How had he gotten here? He was the man from the photo, but no. This couldn't be real. He couldn't be here. He began walking toward me, slow and deliberate, his steps echoing in the silence. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. My legs felt like lead, my body paralyzed with fear. The closer he got, the more I could feel the air growing colder. His presence weighed heavily on me. It was like the temperature had dropped a few degrees with each step he took. Finally, he stopped, just a few feet away from me. His face was emotionless, as though he were a mere shell, a puppet controlled by something far worse. And then, in a voice that seemed to echo from far away, he spoke. "You opened the door." I couldn't answer. My mouth was dry, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was this the man from the photo? Was he real? Or was I dreaming, losing my mind? His eyes narrowed, as if reading my thoughts. "You shouldn't have. Now you've crossed the line." The hallway around us seemed to grow darker, the shadows lengthening. The walls seemed to close in even more, the air thickening with every breath I took. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't respond. It felt as though I were trapped in this moment, in this place, unable to escape. The man didn't move. He didn't blink. His eyes were still locked on mine, hollow and empty, and I could feel the weight of his gaze like a force pushing down on me. "You've seen it now," he whispered. "You can never unsee it." And then, in an instant, he was gone. The hallway was empty. The silence was deafening. I stood there, unable to move, unsure of what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Was he really there? Or had my mind fractured, twisted by whatever force had been pulling me deeper into this nightmare? I stumbled back toward my office, my hand shaking as I reached for the door. It was the only thing that felt real anymore. But when I pushed it open, there was nothing there. Just the empty office. No sign of anyone. No sign of anything. The phone on my desk buzzed, breaking the silence. I hesitated before answering. Could it be him again? The same voice? I picked it up, and the familiar, cold tone echoed in my ear. It's not over. I slammed the phone down, my heart pounding wildly in my chest. This was just the beginning. Whatever this was, it was far from over. I stood frozen, staring at the dead phone. The words he had whispered echoed in my mind, replaying over and over like a haunting melody. It's not over. The room around me felt alien, the walls closing in tighter with each passing second. The dim light above flickered, casting long shadows across the office floor. I glanced at the clock on the wall, 3 o'clock. Had it really only been an hour since the call began? It felt like days, weeks, even longer. A chill ran through me. I couldn't tell if it was from the sudden cold in the room or the deep, unsettling sense that I was no longer alone. My heart hammered in my chest, each beat like a drum urging me to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. The air smelled different now, thick, stagnant, almost metallic. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. I froze. They were slow, deliberate steps, like something was approaching. But there was no one visible. I could feel my pulse quicken, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. The tapping from before, faint but persistent, started again, louder now. It wasn't just tapping anymore, it was the sound of something moving. Something heavy. Something alive. I turned toward the door to my office, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. Before I could open it, a strange buzzing sound filled the air, like a low hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The walls trembled slightly, as though the very building itself was alive, reacting to the presence in the hallway. The buzzing intensified, becoming a sharp, high-pitched screech. It was like nails on a chalkboard, only deeper, more insistent. I covered my ears, trying to block it out, but the sound seemed to burrow into my skull, shaking my thoughts loose. Then, I heard it. A voice, faint but clear, seeping through the noise. It was the voice from the phone. You didn't listen. The words sent a jolt of terror through me, and I spun toward the source of the voice. The darkness at the end of the hallway seemed to warp, like a living thing, shifting and contorting into something unfamiliar. Shadows stretched and curled, forming shapes that were too distorted to recognize, but there was no mistaking the presence standing in the center of it. It was him. The man. But he wasn't the same as before. His face had changed, more gaunt, more hollow, his eyes even darker, as though something was consuming him from the inside out. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. He just stared, his eyes never leaving mine. The buzzing stopped suddenly, and all at once, a deafening silence engulfed the room. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to move, but my body refused to cooperate. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to escape, but the man's eyes held me in place. The shadows behind him seemed to pulse, growing thicker, swirling like smoke. I tried to look away, to focus on something, anything, but I couldn't. The shadows beckoned me, pulling me in. I felt their cold fingers wrapping around me, tightening, holding me in place. You've seen too much, the man finally spoke again, his voice cold and distant. It was like a distant echo, reverberating through my mind. You can never leave. You opened the door. Now you belong to it. I wanted to scream, to fight back, but the words caught in my throat. The shadows around me thickened, and I could feel the walls of the office closing in on me. There was nowhere to run. No escape. It was like the world itself was shifting, pulling me into something darker, deeper. I turned desperately to the desk, my hand shaking as I grabbed the phone. Maybe if I called someone, anyone, they could help. But the phone was dead. The screen was cracked, the numbers faded, and the wires were frayed, sparking in the dark like a dying ember. "No one will help you," the man's voice echoed. "No one can hear you." The shadows around me seemed to take form, swirling into figures, twisted and grotesque. They moved toward me, their shapes constantly shifting, as if they were not entirely solid, but more like projections. Their eyes glowed faintly, watching me as I stood frozen, unable to move. "This is your reality now." The man's voice was now a low growl, a promise of something terrible. "This is the price of opening the door. You will never leave. This place, this time, it is all yours now." I could feel the weight of his words pressing down on me, crushing my spirit. The figures closed in, their hands reaching out, their touch cold and unyielding. And then, just as I thought I would lose myself to the dark, a loud, sharp sound rang through the room, a knock. Someone was knocking at the door. The sound echoed through the silence, breaking the spell, and the shadows faltered, retreating for just a moment. I rushed to the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. But when I opened it, there was no one there. Only an empty hallway. I stepped out, feeling the cold air rush past me. The office was gone. The hallway stretched endlessly before me, a long corridor of flickering lights and empty spaces. "It's not over." The voice whispered again, fading into the distance as I walked deeper into the maze of this new place. I didn't know what was real anymore. But one thing was certain. I had opened the door, and I couldn't go back. Have you ever wondered if you could see something that wasn't really there? That was the question that had been nagging at me all afternoon. I was standing in the dusty, dimly lit warehouse, surrounded by forgotten objects, old furniture, boxes of discarded items, and shelves piled high with things that hadn't seen the light of day in years. The air smelled stale, thick with the scent of age and neglect. But it wasn't the dust or the musty air that bothered me. It was the mirrors. There had been 5 of them, each one standing at different points around the warehouse. They were large, framed in heavy, ornate wood, antique, if you could call them that. They hadn't been cleaned in ages, their glass warped with age and grime. But there was something about them. Something off. I couldn't put my finger on it. I was here with some colleagues, clearing out the space to make room for more inventory. It was supposed to be a quick task. But then I noticed the mirrors, and everything changed. I approached the first one slowly, curiosity pushing me forward. It was at the far end of the room, barely visible from where I stood. As I drew closer, I saw that the glass didn't reflect me or the shelves behind me, as I expected. Instead, it showed a room. Not the warehouse, something different. It was a small, dimly lit space, with bookshelves lining the walls and an old, creaky chair in the corner. A cold shiver ran through me as I leaned in closer. I reached out a hand to touch the glass, but something stopped me. It was as if the mirror was waiting for me to do something. I stepped back, heart pounding in my chest. I rubbed my eyes, convinced that I was just imagining things. I turned to my colleagues. "Hey, have you guys seen this?" I called out, but they were busy sorting through piles of old papers and didn't hear me. I looked back at the mirror. The room was still there. But now, something was moving in the reflection. A shadow, just a flicker, but it was enough to make me freeze. I didn't know what I was seeing. It couldn't be real, could it? Mirrors don't show other rooms. Mirrors show reflections. I took another step back, my heart racing. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe I had been breathing in too much of the stale air, but this felt different. I felt watched. "Hey," I called to my colleague, my voice a little more urgent. "Come here. Look at this." It took a few moments, but eventually one of them came over, wiping sweat from his brow. "What is it?" I pointed to the mirror. "Look. That's not our warehouse, is it?" He looked at the glass and frowned. "What the hell are you talking about?" But then, something strange happened. The reflection in the mirror shifted again, and I could have sworn I saw a figure standing in the corner of that dim room, a shadowy figure, too still, too silent. "I'm not crazy, right?" I asked, my voice trembling. "You see it too, don't you?" But my colleague just shook his head, clearly unnerved. "There's nothing there," he said, turning back to the shelves. But I knew what I had seen. I wasn't imagining things. I turned away from the mirror, a chill creeping up my spine. Something was wrong here, something I couldn't understand. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. Could it be a trick of the light? Some kind of optical illusion? But why did it feel like there was something more to it? I moved to the next mirror. This one was placed near the back of the room. As I approached, I held my breath. My reflection appeared this time, but it wasn't right. I didn't look like myself. In the glass, I stood with my hand on the frame, my eyes wide, my mouth slightly open in surprise. But in the reflection, I didn't move. I stayed frozen. The image was perfectly still, too still. And then I saw something else. A figure in the background. It was a silhouette, half hidden in shadows, like a person who was trying to remain unnoticed. I stepped back, my heart thudding. My mind raced with the possibility of it being some kind of trick. But the figure, it didn't move. It didn't even blink. Was it real? Or was I losing my mind? I didn't know what to think. My head was spinning. I took a step closer to the mirror, hoping for an answer. The figure didn't change, but I swore I could feel its eyes on me, waiting, watching. Suddenly, the buzzing began. Soft at first, almost imperceptible, like the hum of an electric current. Then it grew louder. The air around me seemed to grow thicker, heavier, as if something was pressing down on the room. I turned to leave the room, but I couldn't. I couldn't pull my eyes away from the mirror. The figure stepped forward. It moved. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The mirror was empty. I didn't know what I had seen. I couldn't explain it, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. But I felt the weight of something wrong in the air. Something wasn't right in this place. Something about these mirrors. But there was one thing I knew for sure. The mirrors didn't show reflections anymore. They showed other places. Other rooms. And I wasn't sure I wanted to find out what lay behind them. But as I turned to leave, I saw something in the corner of my eye, a fleeting glimpse. A mirror. It wasn't there before. And it was already showing something else. Something new. Something waiting for me. My stomach twisted in knots. I took a step back, my pulse quickening. There was no way I could walk away from this without understanding what was going on. The mirrors had been showing rooms, not reflections, but other spaces entirely. And that one, the one that showed the shadowy figure, it had vanished, as if it had never existed. But the feeling of being watched, of something lingering just out of sight, clung to me like a heavy fog. I glanced nervously around the room, my eyes darting to the other mirrors. None of them showed the same thing as before. The one closest to me was now just a plain reflection, showing only my tired, uncertain face. I shook my head. Had it really been so vivid? Had I really seen what I thought I saw? I forced myself to take a deep breath. No, I couldn't lose myself in paranoia. There had to be a logical explanation. I had to stay calm. I turned to walk toward the door, but as my eyes swept over the space, I froze. The mirrors. They were all gone. Just like that, without a trace. The spots where they had been standing were empty, the dust on the floor undisturbed. My heart thudded heavily in my chest, and I rubbed my eyes, convinced that my mind was playing tricks on me. "Hey," I called out, trying to stay steady. "Where did the mirrors go?" My colleague, who had been stacking boxes by the entrance, glanced up. "What mirrors?" he asked, his voice thick with confusion. "The mirrors. The ones that were just here. There were 5 of them." He walked over to the spot where the first mirror had been, looking at the space as if it were just another ordinary part of the warehouse. "I don't know what you're talking about. There's nothing here." I could feel the sweat on my palms. "I'm not crazy," I muttered, more to myself than to him. "I saw them. They were here, just a second ago. They were showing something strange." But even as I spoke, the words seemed to lose their weight. I moved to the other side of the room where the last mirror had stood. Nothing. Just a blank wall covered in faded paint. I pressed my fingers to my temples, trying to clear the fog in my brain. Could I have imagined the whole thing? But no, I knew what I had seen. I reached for my phone, hoping to find some clue, something that would make sense of all of this. I opened the camera app and snapped a quick picture of the empty wall. The click of the shutter echoed unnervingly in the silent room. "Okay, we need to take a break," I said, forcing a laugh. "I'm clearly losing it. Let's just grab a coffee or something." But my colleague didn't respond. His eyes were wide, his mouth slightly open as he stared at something on the far side of the room. I turned to follow his gaze, and my breath caught in my throat. A mirror had appeared. It wasn't one of the old, ornate ones that had been here before. No, this one was different. It was large, but sleek, framed in silver that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light of the warehouse. It stood in the exact spot where the other mirrors had once been, as if it had always been there. I stepped closer, my body moving almost automatically, as if it were being pulled by an invisible force. The reflection seemed normal at first. Just my image, my disheveled face staring back at me. But then, just like before, the room behind me began to shift. The warehouse was no longer reflected in the glass. Instead, I saw something entirely different. A dim hallway, one that looked too familiar, too wrong. The walls were cracked, the floor covered in dust and old cobwebs. And in the reflection was the figure again. The shadowy figure. Still. It was standing just at the edge of the hall, waiting. I stepped back sharply, my heart pounding in my chest. The air seemed to grow colder, the buzzing sound from earlier returning, faint but growing louder, like an electrical hum vibrating through the floor. My colleague was beside me now, looking into the mirror as well. His face had gone pale. "What the hell is that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure didn't move. It stood in the reflection, its outline shrouded in shadows, just like before. "Do you think this is real?" I asked, my words catching in my throat. "I don't know," he replied, his voice trembling. "But that's not part of this building. I swear." I reached out, almost instinctively, to touch the glass. My fingers brushed against the cold surface, sending a shiver through me. Then something happened. The reflection of the hallway seemed to shift. The walls in the mirror began to move, the cracks widening, the air in the reflection growing darker. It was as if the mirror wasn't showing a space at all, it was showing something alive. Something that was changing, adapting, breathing. And then I saw it. The figure in the hallway was moving now. It stepped toward me, slowly, deliberately, as if it were coming closer from the other side of the glass. I recoiled, my breath catching in my chest, but I couldn't look away. I was frozen. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. It took another step, then another, and then the mirror cracked. A low, deep sound like glass shattering filled the room. My colleague screamed, stepping back, his face pale with fear. I was barely aware of anything else, the cracking, the shadows that now seemed to bleed through the glass, the feeling of being watched. And then, in a flash, the mirror was gone. The hallway, the figure, the reflection, all of it gone. I stood there, breathing heavily, my hands shaking. The room was silent again. The warehouse was as it had been before, dusty, empty, and normal. Except for one thing. The cracks in the mirror were still there. A deep, jagged line ran across the glass, as if something had tried to escape. I turned to my colleague, but he was gone. The only sound in the room was the echo of my own breathing, and a faint, distant hum, just like before. The silence in the room was suffocating. My colleague, who had been standing beside me just moments ago, was gone. The warehouse felt eerily still, as though time itself had frozen in place. I couldn't even hear the hum anymore, though I could feel it deep in my bones. It was as though the space itself was pressing in on me. I stumbled backward, my hands reaching out blindly, trying to grasp something solid. My eyes darted to the walls, to the shelves, to the bare floor, but everything seemed normal, too normal. It was as if the chaos, the mirror, and the strange figure had all been a hallucination. But I knew better. I knew what I had seen. The cracks in the mirror were still there. They ran across the glass, spreading like a spider's web, but the reflection, whatever it was gone. I reached for my phone again, trying to steady myself, to ground myself in the familiar, but the screen was black. The phone was dead. How had it turned off? I looked around the room, my heart racing. I needed to leave. I had to get out of here. But as I turned to head for the door, something caught my eye. A door. I hadn't seen it before. It wasn't there when we'd first come in, but now it stood in the far corner of the warehouse, almost hidden by the shadows. I walked toward it, my footsteps hesitant, the air thick with an oppressive stillness. The door was old, made of wood that had faded with age. The handle was brass, tarnished and cold to the touch. I hesitated. Why had I never noticed this door before? It felt like it had always been here, lurking in the corner of my mind, but only now had it revealed itself. I grasped the handle, and with a soft creak, the door opened. The room beyond was dark, but a faint light flickered from the far corner. I stepped inside, my heart pounding as I strained my eyes to make out shapes in the gloom. The room was small, smaller than I had expected, filled with shelves covered in dust. But there was something strange about the shelves. They were full of mirrors. Hundreds of them. Some were small, framed with ornate gold, others large and plain, but all of them seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't explain. I took a step forward, my eyes scanning the room. The mirrors seemed to stare back at me, their surfaces shifting in strange ways, reflecting not the room around me but dark, warped versions of it, distorted reflections that were just a little too off, just a little too wrong. I froze. In the center of the room, there was a large mirror. It was different from the others. It was completely clear, no cracks, no distortions. As I moved closer, I noticed something else. The room in the reflection wasn't the same as the room I was standing in. It was darker, colder, more foreboding. The air in the reflection seemed to swirl, as if caught in some unseen wind. And in the center of that reflection, there was a figure. The figure was me. But not quite. I leaned in closer, trying to make sense of the reflection. The figure in the mirror was standing perfectly still, staring directly at me with a blank expression. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin as I reached out, my hand trembling. I was drawn to the mirror, as if it were calling me. The moment my fingers brushed against the surface, I felt it, cold, like ice. But there was something else, something wrong. A ripple passed through the glass, and the reflection of the room seemed to ripple with it, as if the boundaries between reality and the reflection were starting to blur. Then, without warning, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I spun around, heart hammering, but no one was there. The room was still empty, save for the shelves of mirrors and the strange, distant hum that now seemed to echo through the air. I turned back to the mirror, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was no longer standing still. It was moving. It was walking toward me. I stumbled back, my body tense with fear. The figure in the mirror was coming closer, step by deliberate step. Its movements were slow, methodical, like it was savoring the distance between us. But it wasn't moving like a person, it was gliding, its feet barely touching the ground, like it was floating. And then, it smiled. The smile was wide, too wide. It stretched unnaturally, splitting the face in ways that weren't humanly possible. The eyes, dark and hollow, locked with mine. It knows me. A chill ran down my spine. I had to get out of here. I turned to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if the room itself was holding me in place, trapping me in its suffocating grip. And then, I heard it. A soft whisper, just barely audible, as though it was coming from the very walls around me. You can't leave. I spun around again, my eyes searching the room for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. The air was thick with an oppressive weight, pressing down on my chest. The whisper had come from nowhere, but I could feel it, the words reverberating in my skull. The mirror, it wasn't just showing the reflection of the room. It was showing something else, a world, a space, where the rules of reality didn't apply. I had stepped into something I couldn't understand. And now, I couldn't get out. I reached for the door, my fingers scrambling for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The space around me felt like it was shrinking, the walls closing in. I pounded on the door, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Let me out. Please, let me out. I screamed, but the silence that answered only made it worse. And then I felt it, a shift, a presence moving behind me. Something was in the room with me. I wasn't alone anymore. I turned to face the mirror again. The figure was gone. But it wasn't. It was standing right behind me. I could feel its breath on my neck. I didn't dare move. My feet felt like they were rooted to the floor, and my chest was tight, as though the air itself had turned against me. The reflection in the mirror was gone, but the figure behind me was unmistakable. I could feel its presence, cold, suffocating, pressing in from all sides. My body tensed, every nerve screaming to flee, but I couldn't move. The mirror seemed to pull me in, like a magnet drawing me closer, closer to the thing standing just behind me. It was close enough that I could feel a chill creeping up my spine, a coldness that went deeper than skin, deeper than bone. I dared not look directly behind me. If I did, I knew I would lose whatever fragile grip I had left on reality. Instead, I took a deep breath and slowly, agonizingly, turned my head to glance over my shoulder. Nothing. No one. The room was empty. I spun around, my eyes wide, searching the darkness of the warehouse. The mirrors were silent now, no longer whispering, no longer moving. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting. And then, the whisper returned. "Why did you come?" It was soft at first, almost a sigh, but I felt the weight of the words pressing against me. The voice wasn't coming from anywhere, it was everywhere, inside my head, inside the very walls. I clutched my head in my hands, trying to block out the sound. It felt like it was drilling into my skull, forcing its way deeper and deeper. I couldn't escape it. "You can't leave." The words were sharper now, more insistent, cutting through the fog in my mind. I could hear the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the far corner of the room. But when I turned toward the noise, there was nothing there. I backed away from the mirror, my feet unsteady beneath me. Each step felt like I was walking through thick mud, as though something was pulling at my legs, slowing me down. The air was heavy with a strange pressure, like I was being suffocated by it. The walls seemed to close in with every passing second. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the room itself was alive, hungry. "You can't escape. There is no way out." I could feel the fear rising in my chest, choking me. The mirrors were closing in, their glassy surfaces reflecting a world that wasn't mine, a world that wasn't even real. I could hear the hum again, faint at first, then growing louder, until it was all I could hear. It was the sound of the room breathing, of the space around me shifting and changing. And then, the door, the only way out, gave way. It creaked open slowly, as if the room itself was reluctantly allowing me to leave. I stepped forward, toward the door, but as I crossed the threshold, the world seemed to blur. The walls bent and twisted, distorting as though I were walking through a fun house. The light flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to reach out to grab me. And then, everything stopped. The world was still. I found myself standing in the middle of a hallway, unfamiliar, sterile, and cold. I looked around, my heart pounding in my chest. The hall stretched out before me, lined with more doors, all identical, gray, unmarked. The hum had stopped, but the oppressive feeling remained. I reached for my phone again, only to find it still dead. The screen was cracked, spider-webbed, but there was something different about it now. It was reflecting the hallway I was in. No, not just reflecting, it was showing something else. Something I couldn't quite make out. Suddenly, I heard it. The soft click of a door opening behind me. I spun around, my eyes searching the hallway. But there was nothing. The door was closed again. I could hear my own breath, shallow and quick, echoing down the empty corridor. Where was I? The thought rattled through my mind, and I felt it, the coldness, wrap itself around me again. Who are you? I whispered to the air, the question slipping out before I could stop myself. The answer came, a voice, clear and hollow. You know who I am. It was the same voice from the mirror, the one that had whispered from behind me. But now, it seemed closer, so close, I could feel it pressing into my mind. It knew me. It knew everything about me. The hallway stretched on, longer than it had seemed moments before. The walls were moving, subtly, as though the hallway itself was expanding, folding in on itself. And somewhere, deep in the distance, I could see the faintest outline of another door. But I didn't move toward it. I couldn't, because I knew what was on the other side. I already knew. I stood frozen in the hallway, my legs trembling, my heart pounding in my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and run, to escape whatever nightmare I had found myself in. But the door in the distance, the one that had begun to take shape in the depths of the hall, held me in place. Something was drawing me toward it. A compulsion I couldn't fight. I took a hesitant step forward, then another, each movement slow and deliberate. The air around me was thick with a strange, magnetic pull, as though the very fabric of reality was warping, shifting, bending to something unseen. The hum returned, faint at first, but unmistakable. It was the sound of the room, the hallway, breathing, living. The voice echoed in my mind once more, clearer now than ever. You know who I am. I clenched my fists, willing myself not to listen, not to succumb to the growing fear that threatened to consume me. Every step I took felt heavier, the weight of the world pressing down on me. The hallways seemed to stretch endlessly, like an illusion that wouldn't end. The door, once faint, was now clearly visible, its dark wood glistening under the dim light. I reached for the door handle, my hand shaking, my breath shallow. The moment my fingers made contact with the cold brass, the hum intensified. It vibrated through my very bones, as though the sound was coming from inside me, as though it was part of me. Without thinking, I turned the handle and pushed the door open. A flood of cold air rushed out, and the light from beyond the door was blinding. It was a pure, sterile white, so bright it hurt my eyes. I blinked, trying to adjust to the sudden change, and when my vision cleared, I found myself facing another mirror. It was huge, standing tall against the wall, a perfect reflection of the room I had just left, yet it felt wrong. The reflection was off. It was not a mere replica of the room, but a distorted version of it. The angles were wrong, the shadows darker. And standing before the mirror was me. The other me. I gasped, stepping back. The reflection grinned, but I hadn't moved. I hadn't smiled. It wasn't my expression, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. The reflection tilted its head slightly, as if observing me, studying me. You came back. I didn't respond, my throat tight, my chest constricting with the weight of the words. Came back? The reflection began to move, its eyes locked on mine. Slowly, it raised a hand, my hand, and pressed it against the glass. I felt a cold chill seep through the air, as if the glass itself had become a portal, a window into something far darker. And then, the reflection stepped forward. It didn't pass through the glass, but it felt like it did. The room behind it warped, rippling like water disturbed by a stone. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang, trapping me in the mirror's gaze. The other me stepped closer, its eyes gleaming with something that wasn't human, something dark, something that had waited for me. The hum from before was now a constant, a vibration deep in the air, surrounding me, pressing in on me. "You never left," the reflection whispered, its voice an echo in my mind. "You were always here." I didn't know what it meant. I didn't understand. But the words lingered, like a chill that refused to leave. The room around me seemed to shift again, the edges of the walls blurring, the floor seeming to tilt beneath me. I could feel the floorboards groaning under my feet, as though the building itself was alive, shifting, breathing, adjusting to something that wasn't meant to be there. I turned and ran, my mind screaming, my body desperate to escape the reflection that now consumed everything. The door that had once been open was locked, and no matter how hard I tried to push or pull, it refused to budge. The walls were closing in again, and the reflection's eyes followed my every movement. I was trapped. I reached for the mirror again, not knowing why, not understanding the force that was driving me. As my hand touched the cold glass, the world shifted one final time. The reflection wasn't me anymore. It was the room. It was the room that had become the reflection. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest, the air thick with a tension that I couldn't escape. The hum had reached its peak, and the sound was now a roar, deafening, filling every corner of the room. The mirrors began to crack. And with the final, shattering sound of glass breaking, everything stopped. The silence was suffocating. I opened my eyes, and the room was empty. The mirrors were gone, and there was no way out. The only thing left was the reflection of nothing. And I was still trapped. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.